Max.
Society. Let me repeat that. Welcome everyone to this hub event that Ashoka Economics Department is organizing as a part of the Royal Economic Society 2022 conference. The part of this conference that's going to be beamed as a hub event to all participants everywhere in the world will be the evening keynote talk, which by Professor Farzana Afridi on women, work, and technology. But we decided to take, make use of this opportunity to actually organize a mini half-day conference on the very vexed and complicated question of women's work. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the screen. That's because it's there. I'm not focusing on the audience. Women's work in India. And for that, today we have 4 absolutely fabulous papers by scholars who are doing cutting edge work on these topics. But just to introduce the broader set of issues in this debate, I thought I'll take the opportunity of just offering a few remarks. This is not a review of the literature. For that, there are papers by me and others that you can look at, and I'm happy to provide references for any of the points. But I thought I'll just quickly summarize the landscape of the debate on this question, because it is a very heated debate, not only in India, but outside as well. So let me launch straight away into that. In terms of housekeeping rules, A, please keep your phones on silent. B, when the speakers are speaking, feel free to ask clarificatory questions. But if there are substantive questions or questions of debate, it might be better to wait for the talk to end and then engage in a Q&A after every paper. Right? So without further ado, and welcoming all of you to this event, let me start. If the clicker works, I will start. I could just do it manually, actually. Yeah. All right. So the question that gets discussed a lot in the academic community, as well as in the funding, multilateral agency, development, social sector, is what is the issue? What is the persistent issue with labor force participation rates, not just in India, but in South Asia in general? So when you see a distribution of women's labor force participation rates, it's clear that South Asia and Middle East and North Africa, the 2 regions in the world that have seen persistently low female labor force participation rates. And the question is really why? What are the factors that account for this? And the more recent phenomenon in India, which is that of the decline. So this picture shows very clearly that India is, South Asia in general is at the lower end of the spectrum, while Bangladesh, by the way, is moving away from this phenomenon of low levels of female labor force participation rate. Now, coming to India, since the papers today are going to deal specifically with India, we see the orange line at the top, which is female labor force participation rates in rural India. This is using National Sample Survey, Employment, Unemployment, and PLFS data. And you see that the bulk of the decline in female labor force participation rates has been in rural India. In urban India, the rates were always low. There has been slight decline, but it's nothing dramatic. The real decline has been in rural rates. And this is something it would be worthwhile to keep at the back of our minds when we are evaluating the evidence on these questions. So in India, the question of female labor force participation has 2 related but distinct issues. One is that of the low level of female labor force participation, which is more or less a persistent phenomenon since the birth of this country. The second is the decline, the sharp decline that you see in the numbers. And that is really a phenomenon, more or less, roughly speaking, of the last 2 decades. These are related issues, but they are not identical. And therefore, when we look for explanations for trends in female labor force participation rates, we should always remind ourselves that the explanations that fit the low level may not necessarily fit the decline. And that makes the debate actually that much more complicated. Now, when we think of labor force participation rates, we all know, we are all economics students here. So we know that labor force participation rates is really looking at economically active individuals. So those who are employed or are economically in productive employment, work, or are looking for work. So unemployed but looking for work. These individuals in the working age group would be regarded as being in the labor force. Now, because labor force participation is a binary variable, that is either you are in the labor force or you're not, implicitly somehow it poses the question as one of labor supply. Because if you're not in the labor force, and that's particularly the case for women, because women everywhere in the world, and particularly in developing countries, report lower rates of open unemployment compared to men. So when women are not in the labor force, it is assumed that they're therefore not working as in not in paid work, and therefore have voluntarily exited the labor force. It is not, that's not the meaning of it, but that's the way in which the debate gets framed. And because of a binary indicator, it's easy sort of it's tempting to make that connection. So one of the features that one of the features that we have to keep in mind when we look at countries like India is that in South Asia, in India in particular, women are involved as economic workers in family enterprises. I'm not talking about care work or domestic chores or, all the cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, etc. These are economic livelihood activities of the enterprises, which could be farming, it could be kirana shops, it could be some handicrafts, it could be fisheries, livestock, etc., etc. These are economic activities that generate livelihoods and incomes for the family members. And women participate in these economic activities just as much as the men in their families participate. But women are not counted as workers, not by the families, not by NSS or census surveyors, or nor by society as a large. So they see this work as an extension of their domestic chores. And even though this is economic work, these women are not counted as workers, and that is in the labor force. So there's a huge undercounting of women in the labor force. That's because they are unpaid economic activities. Now, why do we see low labor force participation rates, and why do we see a decline? Now, in both of these dimensions, the supply side explanations dominate the literature. Marriage, motherhood, sexual violence, stigma of working outside the home, particularly for upper caste women, where it's seen stigmatizing that you have to work outside the home to earn a living, and demands of reproductive labor, by which I mean not just the actual act of childbearing and birthing, but really a whole gamut of tasks that are that women do routinely inside the home. So cooking, cleaning, house maintenance, fetching firewood, fuel, water, caring, nurturing, a whole range of invisible work, not the kind of work that I talked about earlier, not the economic work, but reproductive labor, which leaves women with very little free time to access paid opportunities if paid opportunities were to be made available. And this demand in India is particularly onerous. And of course, all of these issues are extremely important. They undoubtedly define women's lives in a variety of critical ways. And there's massive amounts of literature on each of these dimensions. The question I want to pose before you today, and we may not reach an answer, but I would like you to think about it, is what is the relationship between each of these and labor force participation rates? And so I think that's the little element that we need to be unpacking here. And moreover, one is the persistently low level, and things like demands of reproductive labor certainly, I think to my mind, explain the low level, but do these explain the decline over the last 2 decades? For that to happen, these factors should have significantly deteriorated, coinciding with the period that women's labor force participation rates declined or preceded it just slightly. So the fact is that while these factors are all undoubtedly important, do they explain the decline? And that's something that we should be discussing. So in terms of the measurement issues, as already mentioned, that when women are involved as unpaid workers in economic enterprises, they are not counted as workers. And I'm not talking about the care work, the care economy that's very commonly talked about in the gender literature. Repeated rounds of the National Sample Survey, as well as individual surveys, highlight Indian women's willingness to work if work was made available at or near their homes. And by work, this refers to paid employment. And so it's demand for part-time work, full-time work, casual, regular, etc. The point is that these percentages are greater than 70, 80 in every single round. But it's always, there's a caveat, which is it should be either at or near their homes, which suggests the onerous burden of domestic chores, reproductive labor, because of which they just can't leave homes completely. So what do these data highlight? These data highlight unmet demand for work, that women do want to participate in paid work as long as it's compatible with domestic chores. And the predominant responsibility of the reproductive labor, which is something that I explored in a paper of mine with Naila Kabir, which is titled Norms That Matter. So we argue that the real norm that matters in terms of explaining low levels of labor force participation rate is the norm of women being predominantly responsible for domestic chores. These data also highlight the inability of women to access work far away from home. And this transportation constraint has been highlighted through other papers as well, which is that if the transportation constraint were to be eased, a greater number of women would be able to take up jobs that may not be immediately near their home, but a sort of a manageable distance away. At the time, during the time that, is it clarificatory, Rahul, or is it? Yes. Yes, yes. Both, you can measure it both through NSS surveys, but we also do that in our paper and through our primary survey that we did in West Bengal. So you can actually ask women, and plus there's time use survey, which has recently come out. So through all of these data sets, you can actually measure the unpaid economic work that women do on family enterprises. Yeah. At the time that women's recorded female labor force participation has been falling in India, that period has also seen an increasing involvement of rural women in self-help groups. So the subscription into self-help group membership in NRLM SGs as well as other SGs has increased, so much so that the number of women today in who are members of rural self-help groups exceeds the combined population of Australia and Canada. That's how large the number of women is in terms of involvement. This work, it's not paid labor, but it's work that involves women going out of their homes and meeting with a community of other women who are not related to them and who may not be who may not be known to them until the point that women actually meet them as a part of the self-help group. So that's just a stylized fact to keep in mind. The other stylized fact to keep in mind is female migration for reasons other than marriage. So when you look at interstate and inter-district female migration, most of it is related to marriage. Women migrate in order to get married. But the women who who migrate for reasons other than marriage, that a proportion has increased between 2001 and 2011 censuses. 2021 we don't have yet, so we don't know that. Yes. For work, looking for work. Yeah. Or education. Yeah. So that's the whole point, that while marriage is the single most important reason and continues to be for women's migration, but we also have to note another trend which talks about, which shows an increasing proportion of women who migrate, that migrate for reasons other than marriage. And that's something to also be kept in mind. And most important stylized fact of all is that exactly during the period where female labor force participation rates have declined, has seen a huge entry of women into higher education institutions all over India, regardless of the size of the city, and pretty much working in the same social environment that defines workplaces. So there are problems of transportation, there is problem of sexual harassment, there's problem of safety, there's problem of street lights not functioning. So all the constraints that we usually think of when we think of women accessing work actually are present, and family opposition. But women, young women, most heroically battle all that and actually come and study. And our classrooms are the biggest example of that. But even if you went outside Ashoka, the trend increasing enrollment of women in higher education has been a consistent trend. I don't know what COVID has done to this trend, but at least pre-COVID, the male-female gaps in enrollment in education had more or less disappeared. There is some degree of gap at the very highest level, but even that is not significant any longer. So, and the final point is that every country in the world that saw an increase in female labor force participation rate, it was preceded by or accompanied by a decline in maternal mortality rate. So it seems to be some sort of a historical precondition for female labor force participation rates increase. South Asia was one of the basket cases as far as maternal mortality was concerned, but that situation has been rapidly improving. If you look at India's maternal mortality rate, it's a steady decline. So in 2017 in India, maternal mortality rate was 145. And if you compare that to the mid-1940s, UK, US, and Australia, which is the time period in these countries when female labor force participation rates really increased. If you compare today's rate in India, which is 145 with 209 UK, 228 US, 285 Australia, this is all data from Our World in Data, we find that one of the main preconditions historically for women to enter the labor force, which is a decline in maternal mortality rate, we do have that in India. So my point is that several of the preconditions that elsewhere historically countries have seen for women to enter the labor force, we do have those material conditions in India. Then the real puzzle is, why don't we see more women in the labor force? Yes, Asawal. I have a great, several slides on norms. So can you just hang on to your norms question? I haven't yet gone to the norm story. I just wanted to present some stylized facts and then I'm going to go through the norm story. So anyway, this is MMR. Okay. The final question I'll raise, and then I'll move on to the norm story, because norms is the sort of the most predominant explanation these days, both for the low levels as well as for the decline, which is that, again, because labor force participation is this binary indicator, it is also tempting to slip into the feeling that either you're in forever or you're out, which is what happens with men in the working age group. Typically, I mean, there is unemployment, but that still counts as labor force. So typically men in working age groups are, they enter the labor force and they're either employed or unemployed, but they stay in the working, in the labor force until it's time for them to retire. Whereas for women, that's actually not the case at all. And data sets for developed countries allow us to track women's transitions in and out of the labor force because there is good quality panel data available. Until we had CMI to work with, we didn't have that good kind of quality. Good, I'm not commenting on quality of CMI data because that's a debate that's raging right now. But nevertheless, it is panel data. And it allows us to track the movement of women to see whether, in fact, we see multiple transitions. And Jitendra Singh is sitting here. I can't see him, but he's somewhere here. And Jitendra's work, I've also contributed to this, which is we show that, in fact, Indian women exhibit multiple transitions over very short periods of time. So it's not as though there are women who stay in all the time, and there are women who stay out all the time. But when you think of transitions and you look at a 4-year period, at least 44% of the women in this data set are in the labor force for at least one period, or who made at least one switch in and out, right? And so basically, this also throws a question mark on factors driving women's labor force participation. Is it something structural and persistent, or are there, immediate or immediate factors, or things like availability of jobs, good old-fashioned economic explanation that might also explain, women's decline in labor force participation rate. So here is a picture from CMI, which shows actually that the decline, according to CMI, it was both in urban and rural areas, whereas obviously in NSS, we saw a little while ago that it's mainly a rural phenomenon. I won't spend time in reconciling the two surveys. I already mentioned this. Indian women's labor force participation rate is marked by volatility and frequent transitions. And these reasons for entry and exit, we looked at reasons for entry and exit, and we don't find any systematic correlation between marriage or childbirth or any other momentous event in the family, like, male unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So these factors don't seem to explain the whole, pattern of entry and exits. Anyway, on our paper another time, I'm not presenting our paper here. Some other things that we need to keep in mind when we look at this pattern of entry and exit, which is when you look at the growth of the Indian economy between 2000 and 2011, which is a period which also saw the start of the decline. That was marked by more or less a jobless growth story, which is that there was increase in rate of growth of the economy. It was not accompanied by an increase in employment. Since the last 7 years, even the growth story has faltered. So to the extent that growth generates jobs, we don't even have the precondition of growth any longer to think of that. So we also show in our paper, I've shown in another paper, that negative shocks like demonetization, COVID-19 have disproportionately affected women's labor force participation compared to men. Farzana Afridi, who's our keynote speaker for the evening, Kanika Mahajan, who will also be presenting another paper today, their work shows that changes in agricultural technology in rural India has displaced female labor more than it has displaced male labor. So there are issues that relate to the sort of standard economic explanations that might provide us with a clue to understand a decline. There is this famous U-shaped relationship between education and female labor force participation rates. And while Indian women's education levels, we don't find, because of the U-shape, what we find is that men with middle levels of education are able to get work as blue-collar workers or as mobile repairers or whatever things, sort of the semi-skilled kinds of jobs. But women with similar levels of education are unable to find work. So you find women with very low levels of education in the labor force and working, and you find women with high levels of education working in more skilled occupations. There's a middle level that is unable to find, and not everybody is looking for NREGA jobs. Certainly urban Indian women don't have that option. Rural Indian women also, when you have class 10, class 12 education, NREGA is not the first option that to be looking for, and it's not, you don't have those kinds of jobs. Now let me come to a little bit very quickly. I'm going to zoom through some norms issues, since that is the elephant in the room that I have not yet addressed. Now, what are the norms that actually are very prevalent in South Asia? One is when you see the left side graph, that's the female to male ratio of time devoted to unpaid work. And the right side graph shows you the belief in the male breadwinner model, right? And you see that these graphs are mirror images of each other. So women spend up to 10 times as much hours on domestic chores. And it coincides with a very strong belief in the male breadwinner model. So the inequality, the gender inequality at the workplace or in the sphere of paid employment, to my mind, is a mirror image of the gender inequality in the domestic sphere, where women have this burden of domestic chores or reproductive work, where either women have to do it themselves or get it done. Regardless, it is their job to get it done. Okay. South Asia has been described as a belt of classic patriarchy. So it's patriarchal, patrilocal, patrilineal. All three traditions are very strongly present. The matrilineal systems are more or less disappearing. So this is, this is what South Asia is. And there is, patrilocal marriage norms, patriarchal family norms, patrilineal inheritance, etc. And what this results in, the norm that really is an issue in South Asia, is the norm of very strong son preference and discrimination against daughters, right? And there are papers in the context of the United States that show that greater son preference is associated with lower levels of female labor force participation when they look at across county differences in labor force participation rates in the US, but I haven't seen that kind of work in India. So the link between son preference, which is a very strong norm in India, which contributes to female infanticide, missing daughters, skewed sex ratio, gender discrimination within the household, all of these are very important issues. But the direct connection explaining labor force participation, lowering female labor force participation, that's a little bit weaker. Do we have have norms, these strong son preference norms, have they seen any change? This is a graph from CEDA based upon NFHS self-reported participation in decision-making. The recently released Pew report also highlighted some improvement in women's perception in terms of, how much participation they have in decision-making, etc. So there's been some change. But what does history tell us? How fast do norms change? Here's a graph from Our World in Data, which is home production in the United States between 1900 and 2005. And you see that, of course, there's been a big change when you look at a period of a century or more. But the change is slow. And if this graph is accurate, then it seems like it's sort of tapering off, right? And even despite the considerable change, women still do much more in terms of home production than men do. So while norms absolutely must change in South Asia, but we have to also keep the role of norms in effecting other changes in perspective, right? To expect that first all the norms must be radically changed, then we will start seeing women's participation in labor force. I think that's an unrealistic and ahistorical ask, because that's not the way it has happened in any country. Norms have changed. Also, increasing presence of women in the workforce has also contributed to a change in norms. So it is a cyclical relationship. I will probably skip these graphs. I'm happy to share my slide. This is about violence, and this was some global correlations we had done between presence of sexual violence and female labor force participation rates. And bottom line is that the correlation is really weak. So while sexual violence all over the world is a very important and serious issue, its relationship with female labor force participation at the macro level is less obvious. This is the jobless growth story graph that shows you the jobless growth. And let me now end by talking about gender parity. So the basic point, which is what I was trying to show with those two graphs, is that gender parity in the world of work is unlikely to be achieved without gender parity in the domestic sphere. So both have to work at the same time. Now, the state policies can't enter people's homes and make them change their behavior. That's not happened anywhere in the world. I mean, maybe China, they tried it, but it's not sustainable. So we have to think of where is it that we can push the needle. And my argument here is, my suggestion here is that maybe we push for gender parity in the labor market. And that might have some feedback effects on gender parity inside the home. Son preference. One of the lessons from the son preference story that we have to draw is from South Korea, which is that one of the factors that led to a decline in son preference was increasing female labor force participation. Because as economic value of daughters increased, parents' dependence on their sons as the chief sources of support, that weakened. And that's the element that's missing in India completely. And so even to weaken the norm of son preference, it doesn't go away completely, but even to weaken that norm of son preference, I think the challenge is, and the top priority has to be increasing female labor force participation rates. And as I argued before, we have a lot of the preconditions, but we don't have the jobs. So I think the focus needs to be on employment growth, particularly the kinds of jobs that women can access, and of course, removing all the barriers, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So I definitely think it's a demand side story more than a supply side story in terms of the decline. In terms of the low level, yes, there are many norms related factors that explain the low level. Finally, we have to have greater representation of women in all decision-making bodies that take decisions that impact women's lives. So whether it is employer, corporate boardrooms, whether it's government, from panchayat level to all the way to the top, all of these bodies are making decisions on an everyday basis that affect the lives of women. But women have very little say in any of these decisions. So even when we are thinking of changing this landscape of women's employment and economic empowerment, we have to first, alongside, focus on better representation of women. So I will stop here. Maybe take 2 quick questions and then hand over to Kanika. Sawal, do you have anything quick, or we can talk later? Yes, Suraj. I think you need the mic for it to be recorded.
Oh, right. So I was just wondering if if we break down the aggregate data of women's labor force participation coming down, is there anything that seems to work? Like, is there a state which is doing better? Is there a variable which, if it's in the right phase, that improves labor force participation? Because that was at the national level. So have we learned something if we disaggregate the data a little bit?
I think that's the challenge that we are. So there have been, small studies, let's say, of transportation. So that's a small bottleneck, which if you solve that, then there can be, you see some effects. But overall, there haven't been any sort of success stories. At least Kanika might correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I mean.
Can I ask a more specific question? So decline for all states, perfect. There was this thing about women getting inheritance also. Did that make any difference?
Labor force participation?
Yes.
No.
So financial independence also does.
Well, there are some policies that are pro women where things get worse before they get better. And one of those is also the question of inheritance, because one issue with female inheritance is there's a lot of opposition to it. So even though it's a law and you have to do it, there have been some adverse consequences of that as well. But no direct impact on labor force participation, as far as I know. Kanika, have you seen a study that? Okay. On labor force participation. I know that there's a paper of sex ratio. Sonia Balotra has done work on child sex ratio at birth and female change in female inheritance. But I haven't seen the labor force participation paper. Yes.
The latest PLFS data 2019-20 actually shows an improvement in the female workforce participation rate and labor force participation.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a dubious interpretation of the data. I don't want to cut into Kanika's time, so we'll talk about that. But there is an issue. In fact, the CEDA, the Center for Economic Data and Analysis, so PC Mohanan, who is to be the chairman of the NSS, he's written a piece on that. So take a look at that and we'll talk about it later. Quick question. We can, by the way, also chat in the breaks. So ask a quick question and then I'll get Kanika to.
Sorry, I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know that we discussed unpaid work in family enterprises, but there's also debates on subsistence work. Although the United Nations says that this is work which should be counted within the production boundary and the system of national accounts, India only considers subsistence work in terms of production of primary goods. So I wanted to know, are we able to capture this work and the implication of granting worker status to people involved in subsistence work? And I just wanted the take on that. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think that, I think Nepal has done something like increasing, counting, activities like, for example, fetching firewood, etc. As part of I'm a little conflicted about that, because what ends up happening is that nothing changes on the ground. You suddenly have a shooting up of labor force participation rates. Like if you see Nepal data compared it to India, you'll see a sudden increase in. So I think it's a statistical artifact, and that's not what we want, right? We want women to be engaged in remunerative, paid work. That's also actually good job. That's a larger debate, not just women, but men too. But certainly women, we want them to be engaged in remunerative paid work. So by changing the definition and, with some sleight of hand, you can increase the numbers. But that's not really what we would like. Yeah.
I just have I just want to know about the US reference that you just mentioned, the reference of United Nations that you just mentioned. United States.
I will give it to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one more question was on commutation for paid work. So, like at par with United Nations, Indian women still spend less time on commutation for paid work. So I'd ask about that in the lunchtime also.
Sure. I think she has a question, and then we'll call it a day, because she's raised her hand. No, I think it won't get picked up. It's getting recorded, so you need to speak on the mic.
Ma'am, most of the unpaid domestic work falls on the women, but ma'am, don't you think there's a bifurcation even that, depending on the marital status, like women who are married tend to have more unpaid domestic work than women who are unmarried?
So there are two types of work that women do in the house. One is unpaid economic work. So working on the family farm, for example, or rearing livestock or something. So when I was talking about the earlier bit, I was talking about women and men run the family enterprise, but the men in the family enterprise get counted as workers, but women don't. So that's also economic work. But because women are unpaid and they don't have a say in the sharing of the income that gets generated from the enterprise, they don't get counted as workers. The domestic chores, the reproductive labor, that's another story. That my view is share the load. Men and women should both. It should not be a woman's job only.
No, ma, I'm saying that the differential, the hours worked, the hours given to unpaid domestic works would depend on the marital status of the women.
I don't know if there. I'll have to check the data. I don't know what the difference is. That comes from time use data, and I don't have that number. But on this note, I will stop the discussion for now. We can continue discussing in the break. I have already eaten a little bit into Kanika's time. And so the next speaker is Professor Kanika Mahajan from Ashoka.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks, Ashwini. So I guess most of you sort of got the landscape that we've been, at least in terms of the gender gaps in employment in India. The paper that I'm going to present today, it's joint work with Suga Chaturvedi and Zara Siddiq. What we are going to delve into this paper is that once women have decided to enter into the labor market, what kinds of gaps do we emerge? What kinds of gaps do we see as emerging, especially at the application stage? The clicker is not working. Okay, so hopefully the teething troubles are gone. So in this paper, of course, the paper is motivated by the large gender gaps in employment, as well as gender gaps in wages. So for instance, we've already seen that on an average in urban India, about 20% of women are engaged in employment. And if you look at the wage gap, approximately on an average, an urban woman who's working earns about, who's in paid work earns about 70% that of a man. And a lot of this gap is actually explained by men and women working in different occupations. So there's a lot of occupational segregation that explains the large gender wage gap that we observe not only in India, but even in fact across the world. But more and more recent literature is showing that that the rate at which the occupational segregation is closing is not the rate at which the gender wage gap is closing. And that's something which people find even for developed countries like the US. And this literature has hence started looking at what are the kind of job attributes that may be present even within an occupation, which prevent the gender wage gap from closing. Maybe some attributes are valued more by men as compared to women, or by women as compared to men. And these can lead to emergence of gender wage gaps within an occupation. In this paper, what we do is that we delve into this aspect a little bit more with the Indian data. And we use the data at the application stage when candidates apply for jobs. At that stage itself, we try to see from the job ad and its text what kind of attributes are coming out, and whether these attributes are affecting the posted wages, as well as resulting in a differential search behavior by candidate depending on their gender. So that's the bigger question that we're interested in this paper. And what we exploit to be able to answer this question is prevalence of something that's very special. I say special because it's usually present in a very few countries across the world, which is presence of explicit gender requests on job portals. So for instance, this is an example of two job ads. And on the left-hand side, you can see a job ad. There is no particular field in which the job ad says that we want only a woman. But here in the job description, they say that candidate should be a female only. In the right-hand side, the title of the job ad tells you it's for a male. Okay, so employers tend to use these kind of methods and tools to be able to show their explicit gender preference. Yeah, Rahul. Mike.
Thank you. Just a very quick question. Is this explicitly outlawed in the law? As in, like, is there a law which says that?
It's not outlawed in India so far. So though gender discrimination is per se outlawed, but this is not outlawed in India so far. And but in countries like the US and now even in China, this has been banned. It's explicitly banned in the law. You cannot put a gender preference when you post a particular job ad in most of the countries of the world. Only a few developing countries still have this. In fact, government portals in India have an explicit field. So private portals don't even have an explicit field, but government portals have an explicit field where you can actually put in whether you want a male or a female, which is even worse. So, okay. So this is what we exploit in this paper. We basically use the presence of these gender requests by employers on an online job portal. We first undertake a text analysis to estimate, what predicts the occurrence of these explicit gender requests. And using that prediction, we infer that for other job ads which don't have an explicit request, do they have attributes or features which sort of correlate with gender requests that employers place otherwise on a certain select set of job ads? We then uncover, what are these words? What is exactly going on when employers place these requests, and the kind of systematic associations that we want to draw are along the dimensions of hard skills, soft skills, personality, and flexibility. And we look at how these are related to both posted wages as well as the search behavior of candidates. To give you a brief review of the broad findings, approximately 7.5% job ads on this platform have an explicit gender preference posted, of which about slightly more than half are for women and about 3.5% are for men. Importantly, jobs with an explicit female preference have the lowest posted advertised wages on the platform. Second finding is that even amongst the job ads that may not explicitly state a gender request, if they have job text, which is predictive of a particular gendered sort of request, even if you explicitly don't have it, then if it's tending more towards a female kind of a request, then it would have a lower posted wage and it would receive an increased share of female applications. Lastly, the word-based analysis shows that words related to categories of skills and job flexibility matter the most when it comes to affecting posted wages as well as affecting the search behavior of candidates. The literature that we contribute to, so the first major literature that we contribute to is the one that has already examined the presence of gender preference in countries like China and Indonesia. It has also examined that when you suddenly take away these gender requests, what happens to the female share of applications? Do they become more neutral? The second set of literature that we contribute to is the literature that examines how job ad text can affect gender disparities. So for instance, if you change the occupation, if you change the way it's stated, does it change the share of female applications that you receive? The third set of literature, which has looked at And different attributes, specifically flexibility. And here flexibility, which is often defined as part-time versus full-time work, or in terms of the number of hours of work that you need to put in, and has examined that women in general have a higher willingness to pay for flexibility defined in this manner as compared to men. So we basically build on these sets of literature and just add more to what we already know. In terms of data that we use posted jobs, about 1.6 lakh jobs. This particular job portal that we're using, it caters to young urban job seekers. It's a very specific portal. We use about a year and a half of data pre-COVID. Here, the good part of this data is that we can actually see wages, which is not really present for most job portals in the developed countries, where in general employers do not post wages. So here we can observe wages for about 87% of the job ads. During this time period, there were about 1 million job seekers on the platform, who made around 6.45 million job applications, which we can see. The most important variable that we need to derive for our analysis is whether or not a particular job posting has a gender preference, and if yes, then for which gender. And to undertake this, since we don't have an explicit field per se, we undertake textual analysis and look for specific words which might indicate, for instance, explicit female preference. We call these as F jobs, which might indicate male preference, which we call as M jobs. And if a job ad contains none of these words or has both words, then they are called N jobs. We also get these jobs actually manually tested. We, of course, undertake this textual analysis, but we also get two annotators to go through each job ad and then verify whether the way we've classified is actually correct or not. And using this methodology, we're able to show that about 7.5% of job ads have an explicit gender preference. The second set of important variables that we use the education requirements and the experience requirements which are posted on a job ad. Third, we use the occupational classification. So here, the portal per se doesn't classify jobs into different occupations, but what one can use are the job titles. So the existing literature has already shown that job titles are very informative of the kind of job that might be posted. And here we basically use a clustering method, which puts together in clusters the job titles which are semantically similar. So instead of using the same word coming across job titles, which is the general methodology that most papers have used, we use not just exact same word occurrence, but we use semantically similar words, as if you have a transcriber versus a translator coming, and they would be put under the same occupation. To give you a broad overview of the kind of job ads that we see on the portal, so about 51% of the job ads require at least college education, and 67% require 1 or less year of experience. So again, they're catering to fresh, out of college, job seekers, and they cater to both very high education as well as even diploma candidates. On an average, a job seeker is about 24 years old, and about 85% of them have a university degree on the platform. And 35% of the job seekers on this platform are women. So slightly actually higher than the average urban employment rate for women. The posted wages on this platform are about 21% higher than the average urban wage, which basically means that this job platform, as would any other job portal, it's basically capturing the mid to high skill spectrum of jobs in India, not the lowest spectrum of the jobs. The last main set of variables that we will be using in our analysis is what we define as maleness and femaleness of a particular job ad. So these are defined, or in fact predicted, using a machine learning algorithm, which basically predicts the probability that a particular job ad will have an explicit female request, conditional on the job text. So here job text means the job title plus the job description. So we calculate these probabilities both for a female request as well as a male request, which essentially uses a multinomial logistic regression. So just to tell you how femaleness and maleness varies across occupations and within occupation. So across occupations, you would find that femaleness in general tends to be higher in occupations like for a beautician, for a secretary, for a school teacher. Whereas for occupations such as a cargo loader or someone for delivery or an engineer, these occupations tend to be higher on the maleness. So essentially for these set of occupations, you see more of male requests being placed. Lastly, what we also find is that there's also variation within an occupation. So if we look at job ads, even within the category of, say, engineers or even personal secretaries, you would find variation. And to show that to you how that really works is that, so I've just taken an example of a few job ads here, okay? So if you look at the second job ad in both the panels, both are for a business development manager. And what we show you here is the contribution of each word towards femaleness, which is indicated in red, and maleness, which is indicated in blue. So essentially, the first job ad is actually a job ad where the employer stated an explicit female preference. And what the algorithm tells us is that, here you find these words contributing more towards, on an average, towards the red side. Whereas on the bottom panel, the job ad that you see for the same job title, the nature of words that come here contribute more towards the maleness. Yes, Rahul, you have a mic?
Sorry, I seem to be asking a lot of questions, but in your data set, do you also have a way of cross-validating, as in, do you know who got the job or the characteristics of the person who got the job?
Unfortunately, no, they don't track the final hiring.
Okay.
I would have loved to get that data.
Just wondering if the job description also tells you how much whether you need to relocate for the job. So coming back to Ashwini's point.
I'll come to that.
Okay.
When we look at the words, we'll see most of the puzzles being solved there. So hopefully in a few slides. Essentially the same job title for a business development manager, but depending on the nature of words which are being used to explain a particular job ad, either it's a more female kind of a job ad or a more male kind of a job ad, as predicted by the algorithm. And the algorithm is being trained on the explicit gender request being placed. So it's learning from that and then predicting for the others. So as a first thing, what we do is that we sort of verify some of the existing patterns which have been documented for countries like China and Indonesia. And these patterns basically show in the other countries that whenever there's an explicit gender request, these tend to be placed more in lower skill occupations. And we actually verify that. And okay, the click doesn't work for some reason. But okay, then let me just tell you. So basically, gender requests are more likely to occur in jobs that require lower education or lower experience and that have lower wages. At the same time, if you look at the existence of a male preference is more likely to occur in jobs that post higher wages. And female preference is likely to occur in jobs that post the lowest wages. The second pattern that we sort of just to be consistent with the literature that we try to replicate from our data is what happens to the share of female applications when the gender requests change. And here we find that when there is a female request being placed, the proportion of female applicants are more, whereas if there's a male request being placed, the proportion of female applicants are lower. Now, this is expected, right? So if I'm placing a request, but it's something also about how credible is the request, right? So I may wonder whether an employer wants a male, but maybe let me just try. Maybe it's just costless for me to at least apply. But we do see that something is happening on that side as well. Next, what we want to do in this paper is actually to exploit the wages data more, because that's the strength that we have in this data set. So what we try to do is we use the femaleness and the maleness measures that we've derived from the text mining and look at whether they're also correlated with the wages, the same way in which explicit requests seem to be correlated. And here, our dependent variable, so it's a typical Mincer kind of a regression. The dependent variable is the log of wage in job ad I, advertising for occupation J in state S at time T. FP is my measure of implicit femaleness. MP is my measure of implicit maleness. X's are other job-specific attributes like education and experience requirements. Then in certain specifications, we control for occupation and location fixed effects, and the others we don't. I'll show you the results for both. And we cluster the standard errors at the occupation and region level. Oh, sorry, Mike. Okay. Farzana, can you hear us? You can ask your question.
Yeah. If you go back to your specification, I just wanted to clarify, you don't have occupation fixed effects?
No, so we do have. So these gamma J S are occupation. So in fact, we are controlling for occupation within a state, which is even.
No, so I just meant not within a state, but just occupation.
We did that.
Okay.
One can do that also. It holds.
Okay.
This was just a stricter
Thanks.
specification. Okay, another question. Yeah.
Adding to that, can you control for designation within the occupation, or is it like a broad field of occupation?
In fact, occupation, the way it does is a senior manager would be different than, the way, because it's taking into account the titles.
Right.
So it will automatically take that into account.
Okay. Okay.
And plus experience we already control for.
So this is going back to the data. I know you don't know the characteristics. Do you know if the job gets filled or not?
No, we don't even know that. Unfortunately, job portals don't track that. They don't want to track their final outcome. At least not reveal it to us. There's another question. Can we have 2 mics? Is it possible to have 2 mics?
Hello. How about the role of letter of recommendation here? Like, was that there in the data? Letter of recommendation, if
No.
okay.
No. They don't have that field. There's another question here. Maybe you can be loud. Maybe you can just be loud enough.
Okay, basically I want to know that if the job goes off the market, isn't that a signal that the position has been filled up?
No, so the jobs expire every like 2 months.
Okay, and we don't know anything about callback rates as well.
No.
Okay.
Not with this data. Yeah. We only know the application till the application stage, unfortunately. So this is what we can verify. Okay. So going over what we find. So here, so the 2 measures that we've constructed for all the job ads. So here I've divided my sample into the 3 types of job ads just for clarity. So the neutral jobs are the ones for which we are predicting this. In fact, we are predicting this for all job ads using the training algorithm. We're not using the actual occurrence here of gender requests per se. And what we find is that so female lies between 0 and 1. Okay. So as femaleness goes from 0 to 1, the posted wages fall by about 26% when we control for occupations. And when maleness goes from 0 to 1, then posted wages fall by 13%. So here I want to point out that the reference is neutralness. Okay. So if I want to look at net femaleness or the net maleness, I need to take the difference between these 2 coefficients to be able to see what is the effect of net femaleness, and that's negative. So the effect of femaleness is almost double negative as opposed to the effect of maleness in a job ad. And if we take the net of the 2, then there's a significantly lower wage posted on job ads which are relatively more female as compared to male. The second thing we want to test is how the proportion of female applications change with respect to femaleness. Okay. And also if we look at within each kind of job ads, here there are 2 things that I want to point out because there are many things going on here. One is that if femaleness is really low, even if there is a female request present, women don't apply. Okay. It's not the same for men. So for men, if maleness is almost 0, but if there is a male request, they tend to apply still. They're just willing to take a chance. The second important thing is that if you observe the general pattern, it's increasing. So as femaleness increases, there is an increase in the proportion of female applications. And as maleness increases, there's an increase in male applications. And here I'm controlling for occupation fixed effects, okay, within every state of India. The next thing we want to open up is, okay, I've defined this something called maleness and femaleness, but what does that even capture? What is really this black box that I've defined as femaleness and maleness so far? Now, to be able to understand this black box, we want to understand what is contributing to the prediction of femaleness and maleness. So we basically want to understand how each word that we've used for training our algorithm, what is the marginal effect of that word in contributing to femaleness and in contributing to maleness. And here we use one of the methods that's probably the state of art, at least so far, in explainable AI, which is called the method of local interpretable model agnostic explanations, in short line, which basically tells you, the marginal effect. It basically opens a black box of any AI algorithm prediction. It can be used for any sorts of predictions that which may be used for training a particular model, and not just for this particular model that we've used. And the way it really works intuitively is that for every word, it creates a set of counterfactual job ads by removing that word, and then seeing that if you remove a particular word, how much is my score on femaleness and maleness changing? That's intuitively what's really going on in this method. So we basically find this score for every word. Now, there are many words. We can't possibly use all of them. So we need to, use some criterion to be able to sort of shorten the number of words that we're dealing with. And we use a criterion, that a word has to occur 10 times in the set of job ads which have an explicit gender preference. And why we do that is because these are the set of words which help us explain the presence of femaleness and maleness to begin with. And though we have only 3,000 words that we're using for this classification purpose, if you look at their occurrence by volume in the neutral jobs, that's almost 92%. So a large chunk is being captured by these 3,000 words, even in the neutral jobs. We're not missing out too much. We manually classify these words into 4 categories: hard skills, soft skills, personality, and job flexibility. And certain words that we can't classify, like education or if occupation is placed, we put that in the category of others. And these categories have sort of been inspired from the literature. So there's literature which has examined the role of skills in online job posts, etc. So we've sort of just been motivated by the kind of job attributes which have been shown to be important to be able to, commit or arrive at these 4 categories. Now, to arrive at the word list that matters for every category, what we do is that, so for every word, we get a score of how much it contributes to maleness and how much it contributes to femaleness. We subtract the femaleness score from the maleness score. On net, if a word contributes more to femaleness as compared to maleness, it will get a positive score, and that will come as a net female positive category. And if it's negative, then it's classified as contributing more on net to the male category prediction. Then we list the top 20 words just to see, okay, what's going on? Are these different, and how are they different? So here I've listed the words which contribute positively in the column that says female and negatively in the column that says male. If you look at the hard skills, what you see that hard skills associated with occupations such as that of a beautician or accounting, like tally, basic computing skills, Zoho, survey making, Word, basic computer skills again, tend to come more for women. Whereas for men, a lot of skills on the hardware engineering side, as well as software engineering side, on machine learning, even, in fact, Python was also there in the longer list that is usually used when asking for men. On the soft skill side, for women, we see a lot of language-related fluency, communication kind of words coming. For men, there are also communication words coming, but then there are also words like negotiation, liaising, advising that also come in the list for men. Next, we look at the word list for personality, and here looks matter for both men and women in a way. Slightly more for women because they want them to be more pleasing, presentable, smiling, having a certain height, etc. For men, they want good looking, but they also want men who can work in high pressure situations, who are energetic, enthusiastic, methodical, etc. So certain different sets of adjectives being used basically for men and women on these job ads. Last thing, coming to job flexibility. So job flexibility, on the female side, we find only 2 words, which is work from home, which is coming from home, and Skype. So we didn't have Zoom earlier in the pre-pandemic period. So if an indicator was being able to work through Skype calls. On the male side, we have being able to travel, night shifts, relocate, being able to work on weekends, rotational shifts. These kind of words tend to come in when requesting for a male. So Of course, we can't look at the effect of every word on wages and application behavior, so we have to aggregate it in some way. And the way we aggregate is that, for a particular job ad, given that we've classified the words into these different categories, we get the total score that the words that have been classified in each category have on femaleness and maleness. And then for that particular category, we subtract maleness from femaleness to get the net score. If it's positive, then it's classified under the variable FW for that particular category. If it's negative, then it's classified under MW for that category. So we're basically pitting two different slopes for male and female contribution by classifying it in this or by generating the gender category scores in this manner. We then standardize these scores to be able to interpret their coefficients. So we again undertake this exercise for both, actually for F, N, and M jobs. We don't have much power, as you can see, for F and M jobs because they're very few, but let's concentrate on the results for the neutral jobs here. And what we find here is that if you have more hard skills, which are typically female, they tend to get, they tend to have, these job ads tend to have a lower posted wage, whereas female soft skills and personality do tend to get some premium in the market. On the male side, we find that male hard skills, soft skills, personality, flexibility, everything is sort of positively contributes to the posted wages. So if these attributes come, the posted wages tend to be higher in these job ads. Of course, this is not causal; it's completely correlational. That all these features that I'm talking about. Second, we look at the share of female applicants. Okay, so this is what's happening to posted wages, but what's happening to the portion of female applicants? And here we find that job ads which have words which are contributing towards female hard skills tend to have higher share of female applicants. Females don't get attracted by soft skills, or if you're asking for a pleasantly looking woman, they won't apply to that job ad, sorry. That doesn't seem to be attracting them. Flexibility, again, so it's not contributing on net when it comes to female flexibility, but male flexibility. If you have male flexibility kind of words occurring in a job ad, the proportion of females applying to these job ads are smaller. So broadly, these two factors seem to be the most important among these categories that we've constructed after controlling for occupation. We conduct a bunch of robustness checks, which I'm not showing here, but for these candidate level application, like proportion of female applicants, we also undertake candidate level regressions so that they take a very long time to converge because there are millions of applications being made here. But all the results that I've shown you, which have the fraction of female applicants as the dependent variable, go through even if we do this same specification at the candidate level and control for candidate characteristics. We also control for firm-specific fixed effects and then look if our results hold, even if we control for, maybe maybe females are applying to some firms more than the other firms. They're more friendly firms. We also use another way of coming up with the gender category scores. So here we use the median score for a word, but we can also use the contextual score. So for example, the same word, if coming with two different words, can have a different score for that particular job ad. So if we use a different way of sort of getting at these gender category scores, even then these results hold. Last, okay, I've shown you all these patterns, but how does it matter? Like, what are the eventual economic impacts of these? And here, what we try to see is that how the patterns that we've observed in the data contribute to the gender wage gap at the application stage itself. To be able to quantify the contribution of these factors, we use a semi-parametric decomposition method, which is now sort of being used a lot in economics. It's basically a reweighting method in which we reweight one group to have similar characteristics as that of the other group, and then look at what would be the differences between these two groups if they had similar characteristics. We do that to get the baseline wage gap because men and women on this platform are very different, actually. Women tend to be more educated than men on this platform. So we first reweight men and women to make them similar, and then arrive at the baseline wage gap at the application stage, which is about 3.5% on this portal. We then decompose the part of this wage gap that can be explained by application behavior along different dimensions. So of course, the entire is explained by application behavior, but what dimensions of application behavior matter to the emergence of this gender wage gap? So the baseline wage gap is around 3.5%, which you can see. If we control for occupations, and locations, or even for just occupation fixed effects, then about 45% of the wage gap on the job portal can simply be explained by men and women applying to different types of occupations. If additionally we control for gender requests, and an additional 7% can be explained by the occurrence of gender requests. Now, if you remember, the gender requests on this platform only occur for 7.5% of job ads. And given that they occur for 7.5% of job ads, and that they can explain 7% of the gender wage gap is actually huge. Third, we look at our measures of femaleness and maleness of a particular job ad, because this would exist even for job ads which don't have an explicit gender preference. And here the additional explanatory power is 13% if one just controls for these implicit measures. And lastly, controlling for gendered words leads to an explanation of about 19% over and above anything which is to do with occupation. So after controlling for occupation, what is the net effect that's coming from each of these different dimensions? And the residual is actually coming from firm fixed effects. That explains almost 100% of the gender wage gap. So concluding in time, so this project was basically aimed at looking at the application behavior of men and women in the urban labor job markets of India, and trying to understand that how differences might crop up in terms of the jobs that men and women are applying to, both in terms of wages and both in terms of the attributes of these jobs, which may differ. So given what we found, I think these results have implications largely because of two things. One, because literature has found that initial differences accumulate over time when you look at eventual lifetime earnings and how the trajectory of career may pan out for men and women. So even though this is for like youth, a very specific labor market, this has implications for cumulative consequences of these gender wage gaps. And lastly, there's a very recent paper that has actually come out which shows that gender wage gap in applications can explain 70% of the wage gap, eventual wage gap. So they don't have data on posted wages. So because this question was asked, they predict these wages from the actual wages that they observe in the data, but they know hiring data. So they know the final match of the person with which firm, and hence they're able to indirectly do this exercise. So so then the gender wage gap at the application stage actually matters to the eventual wage gap that we see. Let me stop here and sort of take further questions.
Yeah, let's have 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, Farzana, you can ask.
I thought someone was asking a question. There's nobody else.
There are, but you can ask.
Yeah, Farzana, you can ask now. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. The first was, I understand that you're aware of the potential sample selection here, because you mentioned that, the characteristics of women here are different probably from what we see in the real world. And of course that they're, also very different from that of men. I also wanted to ask whether everybody sees all the jobs posted on the portal, or they have a set of preferences which is worked into the algorithm on the portal. So there's specific kinds of job ads that they see. Do you know?
Yeah, so we actually spoke to them, and what they told us that they don't filter on. So it's not like a candidate cannot see a particular job ad, but they definitely they're shown, mostly they filter on job role.
Okay.
That's a kind of filtration they do, that if so they have about 30 odd job roles. So if I've put that I'm more suitable for so if a candidate has put in a preference for a particular kind of job role, which about I think 30% of the candidates do on the portal, only then they would sort the posted job ads in the order of that job role. But they give a premium service if you pay them a fee. And those candidates are like 0.05% of our sample. So we actually chuck them out.
Okay.
For which
So,
they make
I mean,
specific recommendations.
I think you understand what my concern here is in terms of, trying to understand these response rates coming from some of these issues about filtration and algorithm and so on. So, but my broader question here is, I think what I get from the paper is that what you're trying to say is probably this last bullet point over here, that a lot of the way the way the applications are worded may itself contribute to the observed gender gap in the labor market. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So, so we are basically being able to see that at the application stage itself, that the way the job ads are worded is contributing to the wage gap at the application stage. Yes.
Right. So, but my question here is that we don't know, the main concern would be whether this is statistical discrimination on the part of the employer, in the sense, in terms of expectations. So you see in the job market, these are the kinds of jobs you observe the women in, or, giving preference for, or is it taste-based, right? So is it discrimination? So I think that, of course, is always a big, issue in terms of resolving discrimination, because it's very hard to tease out whether it's statistical or taste-based. And and of course, the ideal experiment in terms of trying to understand whether the wording of the ads affect responses themselves or not by gender would be if they see the same ad and then you change, with these attributes, and you present it to the same candidate and see what the response is, right?
Yes.
So there are these various, so I was wondering whether you have anything to say, whether you want to say something about whether you think it's statistical versus taste-based, or whether you can do anything to tease that. And the second is, some of these, again, concerns in terms of what the ideal experiment might be and what the caveats might be from the analysis you have done.
So, from this analysis, we cannot differentiate between statistical and taste-based. That's for sure. We can't hang our hat on anything, because it's possible that employers have gender in mind when they're using these words, but it's also possible that they just have in mind job attributes. They're not really trying to reach to a particular gender, but of course, if my job needs relocation, if my job needs travel, it needs travel. And at least from this analysis, I agree, we cannot distinguish between the two. The kind of experiment that can answer this question needs more thought. I've already thought about it, and it's not so neat actually to be able to tease out taste and statistical discrimination. In fact, there's a recent paper which has done that in another context. But I agree with you. It needs more thought. It needs a different way to measure. You can't even ask the employers. We've also thought about what if you take these questions and show the job ads to employers? What do they think? But even then, it's not clear whether you'll be able to differentiate between taste and statistical. So so at least I've not been able to come up with a way so far.
So
that's important. I agree. I think that's the sort of the bigger question here. Yeah.
So Kanika, I've got again, I think the last point is really important, and I'm thinking this from more of like a macro-y sort of perspective. That's what I do. Kind of, I was wondering if in your data set, and I'm going to ask you a lot of stuff about the data set itself, do you see the same job advertised by the same employer but differentiated either have the same femaleness or maleness scores, or have different femaleness and maleness scores? So like, do you see them both advertise, or do you see?
Yeah, so the same. So so we do see if there is differentiation within firm fixed effects, and there is. Okay. There is sufficient variation in that. So it's not like a particular firm is always posting ads which are more female type. Yeah. No, so that's not the case. So we did check for that.
So the other thing I was going to ask is, do you see the same job re-advertised multiple times like in terms of like, is there a female job which is re-advertised, a job that you score femaleness re-advertised multiple times, whereas a maleness job is re-advertised less? I'm just thinking of it in terms of search costs and churn and stuff like that, which
So
might lead to.
basically, we didn't look at particularly female kind of male type, but we did look at reposting of job ads on the platform. And it didn't seem there were too many. About 6% were reposted in this entire duration. So again, not too many being reposted, but I can check into whether there was a certain pattern in terms of requests, that job ads which have a general request being reposted more frequently. That we can look at, definitely. We haven't done that.
I have one question and a quick comment. So regarding the difference between the taste fit and statistical discrimination, I think there is a paper, I can share it with you. That is kind of a meta-analysis of all the experiments that has been done on discrimination. I think the predominant idea is that mostly, if I'm not wrong, it's statistical discrimination that happens. But I would say that this is not mostly for gender. This is for a whole bunch of other things. And I don't think they have very good analysis for gender. So I can show you how
they've done it. So there's a bunch of papers which has done it. And
yeah, exactly. So the other thing that I wanted to say, and you don't have to answer if this sounds like a devil's advocate question.
No, come on, that's fine.
Why are we not thinking about why women and men are applying differently? If you can say, ask them directly. I know that you don't have access to them directly from this data set, but if you can ask them to do this in front of you and ask this question, like,
so do an experiment.
Why do they choose certain kinds of, why the femaleness for certain types of skills are so low? Or
I agree that an experiment which is like with like students or with just to understand that if I show them the same job ad, okay, will you apply? A, B, what do you think on certain measures? I think that is doable, and we've actually seriously we are thinking about doing something to be able.
Because it seems a lot of
that's what is lacking.
Story as well, not just the side of the phone. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. That's an important thing to close.
So you've talked about how occupational segregation is reducing at a faster rate than gender wage gap. Do we see men being more flexible and occupying women's job, or is it the other way around? Do you see any trend?
In the US, if I remember correctly, it's both ways. More women entering men jobs because women's labor force participation has been increasing over time, right? In the US. So when you have one curve sloping up and the other is almost like flat or going down, so one would enter more the other, but even men are entering. So men entering, for example, that paper by Golden takes an example of men now working more as nurses in the US over time, as compared to say 50 years back, you have more men as nurses in the US now. So things are happening on both sides. You just can't say that only women are going towards men, but I think proportionately more women going in male jobs.
So I remember this State of Working India report that Azim Premji publishes, and I think with the 2017-18, I think they had this, that the previously female-dominated industries or sectors are being more female-dominated, and the ones which are male-dominated are increasingly becoming male-dominated.
In India?
Yeah, in India.
Yeah. Okay.
So
maybe I should take a closer look at that report.
Yeah, so that is why
I missed it completely. So thanks for letting me know. Should I stop? I'm like, because there's the next presentation. I think let me take the questions later.
No problem.
I don't want to. No, it's fine. I think let's proceed with the next talk, and we can sort of talk in the break. Yeah, we'll. Okay. Oh, you want to shorten that a little? Okay, so then 2 more questions.
You can talk to Kanika during the break.
Let's give a preference to
students.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My question is about the period of the study. So you mentioned that you've taken data post the pandemic.
No, it's pre-pandemic.
Okay, so
yeah. We just got it the month the lockdown happened.
All right, ma'am. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, my question is still about the types of ads that one is able to see on the website. For example, Facebook, Instagram, again, based on what types of jobs you see, it again, the algorithm that the website uses itself caters posts for you. Is that something that this website also does?
No, so this website is actually very basic in that sense, because at least till the time that this set was up, because it's also relatively newer as compared to the other websites, they had not put in any algorithm that directs you in this manner. They were just filtering they were more like filters. Okay, so if I've, so if a candidate has a preference for a particular job role, so for them, the most important category was the job role. That's what they told us, that job role is what, if a candidate has put a preference for a particular job role, then we just sort the job ads, bringing that job role up and the remaining down. So, we stop. वो स्क्रीन शेयरिंग ऑफ हो गई. नहीं, मैं वही ओपन करी थी, वो स्क्रीन शेयरिंग ऑफ हो गई. It's already on. Already on.
Mic working? I don't think so. Very.
Hello, everyone. Is working? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, RES and Ashwini, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, for inviting me here. I am Deepshika Bhateja. I did my PhD in economics from University of California, Riverside, where Anil Diolalekar was my advisor. And now I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CDEP, which is Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics and Policy. It's a health-based academic institute here in India. So this paper is co-authored with Anil Diolalekar and Abhik Banerjee, who's a research analyst at CDEP. And the overall topic of this, the question that I'm probing is on the effect of co-residence with parents-in-law on female labor force participation and empowerment in India. Indian culture practices patrilocality, whereby a married couple lives with husband's parents. And according to Census 2011, co-residence with in-laws is quite common in India, and joint family occurrence is quite common, and around 27 to 30% families in India are joint families. And share of two married couples residing in a household has actually increased more so in urban areas from 2001 to 2011. This could be because of the rising housing prices, which forces people in urban areas to live together. Also, the share of joint families and elderly care is expected to have increased due to COVID-19. And with the recent trend of decline in fertility rates, the burden of elderly care is likely to increase in the future. And it's and also Ashwini gave a very good background on declining female labor force participation rates in India in the last 2 decades. Social norms and increase in care work at home is one of the major factors which have led to this decline. In NSS data, around 88% of rural women responded that they require to spend most of the time on domestic duties, and this increased to 92%. From 88%, this improved to 92% in 2011-12. And 55% of rural women reported, yeah.
So just to clarify, when you say the share of two married couples, that has increased. So earlier there were more just one married couple, or it's a large family?
Yes, so it's comparison with two married couples living together in 2001 versus in 2011-12. Even share of households with three married couples living together has increased.
So, but the family size has decreased
Yes.
over this time. So what's
Yes, so I'm talking about people living, so two married couples living together, which means they could be two brothers and their wives living together, or parents-in-law living together. So I'm talking about two married couples. Yes, the fertility rate is declining, so number of children is declining, so family size, overall family size could have been declining because of that. But this is a phenomena in rural areas that the share of households where two married couples are residing has surprisingly increased.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Uh, so it seems like women are withdrawing from the labor market to care, to tend to their domestic responsibilities. So in this paper, so looking at this, it seems important that we look at various family compositions and look at the female labor force participation rates and empowerment of women in the light of these different family structures that we have in India. So why paid work? So because why do we want women to work? Wage work, I'm some of the factors, there are a lot many. Wage work benefits women because it raises their bargaining power and decision-making power at home. And then women's earned income is also important for better health, nutrition, and human capital investments on girl children, and for a decrease in early marriage and childbearing for women. Obviously, one of the major factors is that it imposes a negative influence on the economy by lowering the participation of half of the population. So what are the economic theories? Why do we think that co-residence with in-laws can have a positive or negative impact, or can impact labor force participation and empowerment rates of women? So there are some competing theories which says, so there could be a decrease in female empowerment and labor supply in families where parents-in-law are co-residing, if parents-in-law are decreasing women's autonomy by enforcing patriarchal norms. There's some evidence that living with mother-in-law is associated with diminished autonomy for a woman. And there is also evidence that household head's wife has more decision-making power than junior wives in a household, in joint families. It could also be that the in-laws are ill and require care assistance, which could be constraining women's labor supply. And it can also be that there are so many members in the household, income earning, wage earning members, that women don't necessarily have to go out and work. And on the contrary, there can be increase in female labor supply, especially in the presence of in-laws, if they help with household work and care work. Yes. Farzana, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you wanted to make this claim that women are spending more time within the household and care work, wouldn't it be pretty straightforward if you compare the 1998 Time Use Survey data with the 2019 TUS data, which has been released? I think that would be one straightforward way of testing or at least claiming that hypothesis that you have, because I think a lot of us here are skeptical about, Anna, that was one of the questions that was asked earlier also about this joint families becoming more predominant. And the second thing is, what is the reason why joint families might be becoming predominant is not, it's not exogenous, right? There's some factors which could actually be related to the labor market itself, which could lead to joint families becoming more predominant in the sense that, they are, there's more sharing of risk, and maybe risks have gone up because there are job losses and other economic factors and so on. So I think a little bit more into the hypothesis that you have. And also I'm kind of struggling with trying to figure out whether you are interested in explaining trends or levels.
Okay, thank you for that, for those questions. The reason I use NSS here, I know we don't particularly like that data set too much, but the reason why I use it because it was for the same period that I am, that we are explaining here, that what is really happening in this period between 2001 and 2010-11, because I will go on to explain that I will be using IHD's data set. So I was just looking at that one decade, but yes, in a paper to elaborate more on the care work aspect, we will definitely use the data source that you were mentioning. And then we are looking at levels of female labor force participation rates in 2005 and 2011. So I mean, that was just to motivate that we need to look at co-residence with in-laws, but the main analysis I will just get to in a minute. And I agree with you that that family structures are correlated with labor force participation rates, and low incomes might be forcing people to live together and co-reside with families or share the risks. But that is something which I am not going to delve much into, and maybe we can discuss that post my presentation after the conclusion, maybe. So the main overall research question that I was trying to motivate is that what is the effect of co-residence with parents-in-law on women's labor force participation? And what is the effect of co-residence with parents-in-law on women's empowerment? For identification, I use death of parents-in-law as the plausibly exogenous variation, and use healthy parents, so women who are residing with healthy parents-in-law in the first round as baseline data, and then for the analysis, and then I look at in the panel data how many women lose healthy parents-in-law in the 7-year period of the panel data between 2005 and 2011. So now the main research, the revised research questions therefore are, what happens to women's labor force participation when healthy mother-in-law or father-in-law dies? And what happens to women's bargaining power or empowerment within the household when healthy mother-in-law or father-in-law dies? So for this, we use IHDS panel data, which I just mentioned, which has 2 rounds, 2005 and 2011-12, to estimate the effect of death of healthy mother-in-law or father-in-law compared to alive and co-residing mother-in-law, and father-in-law. So the overall findings, I'm going to just give you a sneak peek into the overall findings. I find a 10 to 11 percentage point increase in female labor force participation due to the death of father-in-law, which is a huge increase of 20 to 24%. And we are unable to detect any significant effects for death of mother-in-law. The findings on women's empowerment due to death of parent-in-law indicates that that we find is that there was an increase of 3 to 3.3 percentage point increase in women's empowerment due to death of father-in-law, which is around a 10% increase, and it is driven largely by increase in women's decision making about child's health and household expenditure within the household, and the financial autonomy, and women getting higher nutrition, which we don't have a direct data on nutrition, but we have a proxy in terms of whether women were eating before or with their family members. So there was an increase in women eating with their family members after the death of father-in-law. We're unable to detect any significant effects or overall significant effects for death of mother-in-law and empowerment of women. But there's an increase in financial autonomy, which is significant at 1% level, and it is at 6.6 percentage point increase in women's financial autonomy due to the death of mother-in-law. We contribute largely to the co-residence literature from developing countries and from developed countries on co-residence with parents-in-law and its effect on daughter-in-law's health and economic outcomes. So a paper which has worked on this is Khanna and Pandey, which also use a similar specification and find mothers-in-law death reduces her daughter-in-law's labor force participation by 10% using the same data set. We improved their analysis by adding or focusing on, we have focused on residents with healthy parents-in-law and make the analysis more exogenous and make the death of the parents-in-law more exogenous. And we also use flexible age controls. There was another paper which recently got published, which looks at the influence of mothers-in-law on women's social networks, mobility, and reproductive health in India. There's evidence from developed countries on labor force participation rates of women being impacted by living in close proximity to mothers and mothers-in-law. And they find that there's an increase in female labor force participation if they live closer to their mothers or mother-in-law in America. So this indicates that grandparents provided some child care transfers. There are other papers also on this topic, but they suffer from endogeneity issues because they just look at compare the labor force participation of women co-residing with their in-laws versus those who are not. And those families can be very different. So Yes, even she has. Farzana, yes.
Yeah, Deepika, I was wondering whether you know about the father-in-law's work status at the
Yes,
time of death.
I know whether the father-in-law is working or not, and I will show it as one of the
Okay.
mechanisms. Yes.
Yeah, so I just had a clarificatory question. So when there's a death of a parent-in-law and you say there's an increase in autonomy and female labor force participation rate of the women,
Yes.
is it true irrespective of the hierarchy of the women in the household? I mean, if there are two married couples and there's an elder daughter-in-law and sort of say a younger daughter-in-law, is it true across both those categories or is there a differential?
Yes, I checked that. I don't show the results today, but yes, it's across. So
Okay.
it's not significant for a particular group, because what I did was I looked at whether their standing in the family improved or the status improved or not, and if they if they switched from being a child-in-law to head's wife, for example, or head. But no, I don't find any.
Do you look at sort of successive deaths? So whether which order they die in, whether it's the father-in-law who dies first and the mother-in-law, or mother-in-law who dies first and the father-in-law?
So even because this is just 2 periods, so if I had 3 periods, I could have looked at, oh, father-in-law died here, then mother-in-law died here, so I could have looked at that. But so in a way, I am doing 2 separate analyses. You are coinciding with healthy mother-in-law, families which coincide with healthy mother-in-law in the first round, and then the mother-in-law dies. That's one specification, and the second one if you're residing with healthy father-in-law, and if the father-in-law.
So just to add to this, families where in-laws are healthy to begin with, they themselves would be a selected sample, right? So in the baseline, what I understand is that you're restricting your analysis to the set of households where A, who are co-residing, and B, where the in-laws were healthy in the baseline.
Yes.
So that itself is introducing some sort of a sample selection.
So I will show you the results for both the total sample and the sample. So that, yeah, and it's robust.
Just a small question. How
Yes.
How are you defining healthy?
I will
parents-in-law?
get to that. Yes, if they don't suffer from any major morbidities, like in the first round at the baseline, I will list out all the diseases like heart diseases, high blood pressure, mental illnesses, tuberculosis, AIDS, all the, yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Just to get you right, that when you're looking at the analysis of the healthy mother-in-law, we're assuming that the father-in-law is already dead in our analysis, or
It's okay. So yeah, he may or may not be dead. So that is because it would really lower my power if I just look at families, which I did. I just looked at families which are residing with both healthy parents-in-law, and if the mother-in-law, father-in-law dies, I get the same result. So therefore, to make the sample size larger and so I have considered them to be separate, like 2 separate analyses. But the results are very robust. That's one thing, especially for the death of father-in-law. Yes.
Just one clarificatory question on the women's bargaining power. So you mentioned about the indicators that you have used for bargaining power. So could you please explain?
We'll
those?
get to that.
Okay.
This is just a sneak peek, and I will elaborate on everything. Thank you. There's one. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so now I will get to all the questions that you guys were posing. So the data set, I'm sure this audience knows that about IHDS, India Human Development Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of about 42,000 households across India. And it covers topics related to health, education, employment, economic status, marriage, fertility, gender relations. And there are 2 periods, 2005, 2011, and 12. And this sample we restrict to women who live or co-reside with parents-in-law and healthy parents-in-law in the first round. Healthy is defined as those parents-in-law who were suffering with no major morbidities in 2005, such as cancer, AIDS, tuberculosis, and all these long-term illnesses. So my sample size is, so this is for the healthy sample. I will show you the results for the total sample as well. So in 2005, around 7,500 women were living with healthy mothers-in-law, out of which around 18% lose their mother-in-law due to short-term illnesses or accidents in 2011. And for father-in-law, in 2005, around 5,360 women were living with healthy fathers-in-law, out of which 27.7% lose their fathers-in-law due to short-term illnesses or accidents. So the main outcomes, we have a question.
I guess this is just a clarification. You're just looking at those 2 dates and you don't know how long the mother-in-law or the father-in-law have been dead, because the time between the death might have an impact on.
Well, I can look at that.
It's just something.
Yes, but I would not. Is there any theoretical basis as to why we think that if the so that's why I've not looked at it.
Let's chat about it.
Yeah, we can chat about it. So main outcomes is our daughter-in-law's labor force participation rates, which is defined by women who co-reside with their parents-in-law and work, in this sample, and work for more than 240 hours. So women who work for more than 240 hours in a year is in IHDS, that's how they define labor force participation, if you work for more than 240 hours a year. For autonomy and bargaining power or empowerment, there are 4 measures of autonomy. There's decision autonomy, there's physical autonomy, financial autonomy, and women who eat first or together with the male members of the household. So this comprises of 11 questions. And physical autonomy means is defined as women's self-described ease of movement to socialize and conduct health and household desired activities within the village. So whether they had to seek permission or not to go out to meet friends and so those kind of questions. Decision autonomy measures women's bargaining power in determining their desired fertility, health of their children, whether they were the primary decision makers when the child got sick, about the child's marriage, about household expenditures. Financial autonomy is measuring the financial independence of women in terms of owning a bank account, having liquidity, and home ownership. So those were the 3 questions on financial autonomy. And this is a single question on women who are eating after men in the household, or women were eating with the men or before. So the empirical specification, there are 2 empirical strategies that are followed in this paper. So I regress the main outcomes, which were described earlier, labor force participation and women's empowerment on death of father-in-law. And we control for number of children because that might have changed over time. It might have increased over time for a woman. Household assets, because that period also saw an increase in GDP growth rate. So maybe there was an increase in household assets, which we control for. And age is controlled for flexibly as well. And similarly for mother-in-law, a similar strategy is used. And also there are individual fixed effects to account for time. Yes.
Why can't you pool the 2 sample and use the 2 variables separately, the death of father-in-law and mother-in-law?
Yes. So that would really reduce my sample, because right now I am also looking at families which are co-residing, because I'm already doing healthy parents-in-law as the subsample, right? So so then I would be looking at only women who are residing with both healthy parents-in-law, mother-in-law, and father-in-law. So that would bring down my sample, because right now I'm looking at women who are residing with healthy mother-in-law or healthy father-in-law as separate strategies. So that would really, but I did do that, what you've suggested, and the results were the same.
Deepika, I'm wondering why it has to be both. I mean, it could be either or, right? Like you just have to pool all the data together.
Yeah.
And you could be residing, it doesn't have to be the case that when you pool the data, it has to be only women who have both a father-in-law and a mother-in-law, right? Or the death of either or, right? Or both.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I understand that, there is a sample issue, because when you, I maybe I'm missing something here, but it's not clear to me. So I think it should be possible to pool it.
Okay, so if what you are suggesting is I look at families which are residing with healthy in-laws, and then I don't know what's happening. Death of either parent-in-law, right? As the you're saying regressing out the main outcome on death of either parent-in-law as a variable. But
No,
then
I'm
I want
saying
to
that
look
you
at
can have death of mother-in-law and death of father-in-law as well. And in that, you will have, somebody who's had, either whose father-in-law has died or mother-in-law has died or possibly both have died, right? So it just gives you the entire set of possibilities.
yes, it what you're saying is does make sense, but it would just make my interpretation a little bit. So I wanted to keep it more cleaner, that the empirical specification that they are residing with parents, healthy parents-in-law, and then they lose one of them. That's why because of looking at healthy parents-in-law, that sample, that's why I also decided to run a separate
The
specification.
concern here also is that I'm not sure whether you have different samples for these two. People
overlap.
residing with mother-in-law and death happens and then a father-in-law. So you want to also look at the same sample, right? Or at least have similar characteristics.
So there's an overlapping sample of families which are residing with both and they lose either. But there can be families where only mother-in-law is present or only father-in-law is present in the baseline. So those families I didn't want to throw out, you see. That's why I used this empirical specification. But I'll think more about it. Yeah. Thanks. I can run that specification, that's what you're saying. I just feel like the interpretation would not be so straightforward. So I'll have to think about it. Thank you. So there is, so I include individual fixed effects to account for time invariant or unobservable characteristics of women that are correlated with their decision to participate in the labor market, and time fixed effects to account for time invariant individual heterogeneity and time trends. And we saw a decline in labor force participation during this period. Standard errors are clustered at the sampling unit level.
Sorry, just a clarification. So while defining the healthy mother-in-law or father-in-law, is it using the self-reports from the daughter-in-law, or is it the information from the in-laws?
From the household questionnaire.
So
household head answered those questions.
So you may want to worry about, what kind of selection it makes, because if the daughter-in-law is reporting the status of her in-laws, and it may have some systematic implications in terms of the bargaining power.
Yeah, so, but this is not from the daughter-in-law. This is from the entire household question. It is not from the woman's question. Yeah.
Thanks.
So that concern is not there. So this is for the total sample. The labor force participation rates at the baseline, and then in the post, in the pre and post, and the post where women actually lost their father-in-law or mother-in-law, and this is across age groups. So we find that in the post period, if you see, the labor force participation rates of women in the younger age group is higher for women who lose a parent-in-law versus those who are still co-residing. And this seems more reasonable, right? Because there are younger women who might be facing more restrictive norms imposed by parents-in-law and more responsibilities at home. But in the pre-period, it is not extremely balanced. It's balanced for the lower age range, but for older age range, women who are going to be losing, are expected to lose their parents-in-law, they have slightly higher labor force participation rates. So therefore, I have controlled for age flexibly in this regression in my estimation strategy. So now I'll come to the result, the descriptives. So as I mentioned, that the labor force participation rates are at the baseline are higher in families which will lose their parents-in-law, and these are also older families. There are older women with lower levels of education, with lower levels of education of parents-in-law to begin with, because attributing to the fact that they are younger families, and also the household assets seems to be lower in these families. So I control for household assets as well. Similarly, for mother-in-law, the families which lose mother-in-law in the first period are younger. At the baseline, the families which will lose their parents-in-law in 2011, at baseline, these families are older families and lesser educated families with lower wealth. but slightly higher empowerment. So the main result for the total sample for father-in-law's death, if you see for the total sample and for healthy sample, it's around 10 to 11 percentage point increase in female labor force participation due to death of father-in-law. And this is significant at the 1% level. And this is actually around 20 to 24% increase. And for mother-in-law, I don't find any effects. It's about 4 to 5 percentage point, but it's not significant. For women's, yes.
So just a quick question. When you do the total sample, do you have an explanatory variable, which independent variable, which has got the health status of the mother or the father-in-law? Because it seems weird to be including it in the healthy sample, but then where you've essentially selected a healthy sample and then not essentially accounting for it in the total sample.
Well, I have not done that so far because I am going to rely on this was just to show you that there is some effect in the total sample as well, but I'm going to, going forward, I'm going to be looking at the healthy sample to explain the mechanisms and heterogeneous treatment effects. But yes, I can include it.
Because I mean, it just feels like you're not comparing like for like when you're looking at total and healthy sample at the moment, if you don't control for healthy, the health level in the total sample.
But if you see, if in the healthy sample there's an increase, and overall also there's a stronger increase, so it seems like even in the unhealthy sample there was some kind of increase because a subgroup, right? So yeah.
Hi. So I wanted to ask if you have controlled for, like, it's similar to what Professor had asked earlier, in terms of controlling for the age at the time of death and whether they were employed at that point or not, in terms of mechanism identification. So if we can, like, if we control for that, can we know if at the time of death, the father-in-law was employed or not?
At the time of death, we already are using that, right? We are seeing, and I control for age. So you want me to control for age at father-in-law or mother-in-law's death. But since the age variable is already controlled for, I think that already takes care of the age group in which for people who are, it's taking out deducting the age factor from the,
What I wanted to ask was, like, essentially if we do a heterogeneous comparison of effects across, like, father-in-laws who died while they were working versus those who were outside the working age.
Small question. So since you mentioned that in the subset of people living with healthy parents-in-law by itself are slightly older than average, wouldn't that also have effects on the death? So like if I am older, if I'm nearing 40 and then my parent-in-law dies, I'm less likely to go out and work anyway. Wouldn't that sort of bias your estimates?
Well, that's why I'm looking at the overall sample and overall effect. Like, what would you recommend that I look at younger women separately and older women? So I do look at women with children and without children because it's about care work, which is one of the main mechanisms. So yeah, but I don't know. What would you recommend?
Perhaps, I mean, again, the question comes back to what Professor Afridi was saying earlier, that maybe we need to look at time use, how time is being allocated across sections before and after the death of a parent-in-law.
So the time use data that ISGS has collected is very systematic. It has a lot of measurement error. So I have purposely not used it.
No, just a suggestion, of course. It's just a suggestion again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can we also look at the effect that whether daughter-in-law was already like employed or not before the marriage? Because that would matter a lot. That after the marriage, like whether death has created and some exogenous shock or not.
So you're talking about baseline empowerment?
Yeah, exactly.
Before she got married. So for baseline empowerment, I'm using whether she was involved in the decision, because I don't have that, whether they were working or, but I have whether she was involved in the decision of choosing a husband or not. So that I use as her baseline empowerment level before she got married. So that is there. in this sample. Yeah, in this particular sample, which is co-residing with parents-in-law, this is, yeah.
So I want to ask like whether this total sample is similar to this Divya Pandey's paper.
Yeah.
But you were showing that they are getting exactly opposite result to this. How for the same sample? I mean.
So we look at, I don't know, I controlled for age flexibly, and yeah, I didn't do anything else apart from that. And actually, this is a paper that I wrote in 2014 as in my PhD, and I've presented it ever in many places. So I was always getting a very significant results for death of father-in-law.
Maybe
Focus the analysis on mother-in-law.
can it be because of taking that a different specification like for mother samples?
We have replicated the results, and the specification is different because we just control for age flexibly, which I have shown you why. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Does it in any way dwell on the role of in-laws education?
I am using that.
Okay.
I will show you that. I think I should, yes. After this, I will present.
Hello. Yeah. Yeah. Hello. So can you add a dummy variable to take account for the age factor of the women? I mean, it's probably the case that the younger women. Okay. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. I've heard all your questions, and I'm going to reply to them, most of them, in the next couple of slides. So on women's empowerment, which is our other main result, which is also kind of a mechanism which is driving female labor force, could be driving female labor force participation. After the death of father-in-law, women's empowerment goes up. So it means that there are less restrictive norms or presence of or absence of a patriarchal figure to enforce these patriarchal norms is increasing. So this is some kind of evidence towards that. So women's labor with women's empowerment levels, which is an average response, which is an index of average response over these various 11 questions that I discussed with you. It increased, women's empowerment increased by around 3.1 to 3.3 percentage points, and which is a 10% increase in empowerment level. I don't find any effects for mother-in-law, and the effects are anyway small. It's around 1.3 percentage point, but it's not significant. So then, because we find some significant effects on empowerment, then so I wanted to show you guys a breakdown also of what exactly is happening within the empowerment index. So it seems like the women's decision-making power or bargaining power at home is going up, and it's going up by around 4.6 percentage points. Their financial autonomy also seems to be going up, and which could be because they are now going out into the labor market working, so they need to create their bank account to work, and so on. So their financial autonomy increases by 5.7 percentage points. And it also seems like their nutrition or level may be improving with the death of father-in-law, who could be constraining it somehow, because now women are eating with their family members, and it increased by 1.8 percentage points. I don't find similar results for mothers-in-law, and the effect is also very low, as I just mentioned. But I find some significance for financial autonomy at 1% level. The financial autonomy of women goes up by 6.6 percentage point after the death of mother-in-law. But if you see even other, I just want to pause and say, even the other coefficients on decision autonomy, physical autonomy, and nutrition, they are quite large. We're not able to find any significance, but they are large coefficients. So then the question is, whose labor force participation and empowerment was impacted most due to parents-in-law death? Yes.
You'd mentioned a paper where they talk about the mother-in-law's death decreasing female labor force participation. Is there a reason why you don't get like that significant result in your
so I already answered.
Results?
My empirical specification is slightly different from that. So, and we are also looking at healthy parents-in-law, which is a more of an exogenous, provides death with more of an exogenous variation. So my results are more, pardon me for the word causal in that sense. Okay, So let's look at so why do we expect that women's, whose labor force, yes.
So I just have one doubt, like the variables, why variables which we are talking about, which are the physical autonomy, decision autonomy. So there are various questions, as you have already mentioned in the IHDS data set. So like, do you compile them and make an index in order to generate them?
I looked at the average response. So first first I see whether they were the primary decision maker or not, whether they say, yes, I take part in the decision making, and then code it accordingly and then take an average response.
Okay.
Okay. So now we expect women with, this is for something for students to think about also. Who do we expect, for which kind of women would the labor force participation or empowerment be most impacted? For low educated women or high educated women, right? So we expect lower educated women with lower autonomy levels to be more impacted by death of parent-in-law, but it could be that higher educated women actually are able to get a job in the labor market because of their education level. So they would show an increase in their labor force participation might go up. So these are just hypotheses. And women with parents-in-law with, if your parent-in-law had high or low levels of education, who's expected to be impacted more? So we expect that women with low levels of PIL or household education, because of lower autonomy or more restrictions in these families. Women residing in rural areas or urban areas. Women in urban areas can show more increase in labor force participation, particularly because of more opportunities, or rural areas because of lower autonomy levels, more restrictions of mobility. Then women from poor families or wealthy families. Women in poor families, because they have to now substitute for a death of an income earning member. Or women from lower caste or high caste. So women from higher caste, as they have more mobility restrictions, and that Ashwini was also talking about, than lower caste women, or lower caste women to substitute for loss in income. So this is the kind of hypothesis. So now let's look at what we find. We don't find any significant difference in along these characteristics for on labor force participation due to the death of father-in-law. So these key socioeconomic characteristics that we were talking about, that whether low or high FIL education, whether they are significantly, those two groups are not. For women who had high or low father-in-law, like education levels high or low, it's still significant for both the groups, basically. And for labor force participation on women as well, we don't find any significance in the two groups. Yes.
Sorry, how are you measuring education? This is binary or?
So it was low or high, right? So it was below average or high, above average education.
But we know there are sorts of this U-shaped thing with
yeah, but this is just for differential impact. So we just group them into whether the woman. So first I look at what is the education level of mother-in-law or father-in-law, and I just look at the mean of that, and then say this is a high group, this is a low group.
But that may be hiding some sort of heterogeneity across very low education, very high education.
Yes, you suggest that I look at non-parametrically. Sure. But remember the sample size is a little, yeah, but sure. Yeah.
If she's a widow or if she's married, so both of these women stay in the joint family. So like, have you also looked at them?
So I looked at, as I was answering to her question earlier, a previous question, that whether the status of the woman in the household changed, whether that impacted differently. So if you became from a junior wife in the household to head or head's wife, which means that she's, so I looked at that and I found similar effects. Okay, I'm really holding you guys from your break. So I feel bad. Yeah. So some pathways, I don't find any significant impacts on empowerment as well. So the pathways I discussed in the beginning, which were elderly care, we have ruled that out because we've looked at only the healthy sample. Child care, so I look at women, so I look at some of these mechanisms. The main mechanism of empowerment has already been looked at, right? So we know that women's labor force participation is going up due to death of father-in-law because her empowerment level is also going up. So there's less restriction, there's more decision-making power for the woman. But let's look at some other things, whether the father-in-law was working, so whether she's substituting for the income or not, so whether there's an added worker effect or not, whether So now I also look at like this extreme case of like women with parda or women facing seclusion and baseline, whether women who at the baseline before their marriage were actually empowered and what is the impact on them. So I look at some of these mechanisms, and I find that women with who are facing some kind of like who are secluded, women with parda, have lesser increase in their labor force participation than women without parda, who are not practicing parda at the baseline. But it is still significant. So even for women who are practicing parda or ghungat or veil of some form, their labor force participation does go up significantly because of the death of the father-in-law. It's not probably as high in magnitude as for women without parda. I don't find anything for, so the results for mother-in-law's death are, so here also I find similar this thing, but the results for mother-in-law's death needs more exploration here, because when I do subgroup analysis, it's not significant. So I'm not, that's why the key takeaway should not be this. The key takeaway is the father-in-law's death, increasing the labor force participation rate. Yes, yes, yes. I have like one more slide. So this, I don't find anything for empowerment on the mechanisms. So I would like to conclude by saying that family structures are crucial in determining women's labor force participation and empowerment levels. So they need to be probed and explored more. And this paper adds to the existing evidence on adverse gender norms constraining female labor force participation rates in India, which I find are enforced mostly by the father-in-law. Death of father-in-law increases daughter-in-law's overall empowerment, including decision-making power. There's also some evidence of death of father-in-law increasing women's nutrition in the household. And contrary to popular media, death of mother-in-law does not have any significant impacts on female labor force participation or empowerment levels. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being so interested in this.
So I suggest that we take a break now for 20 minutes just and get back at 4 o'clock for the next two set of papers. And you can continue talking to the speakers in the break as well. So you could just, there's facilities outside. Farzana, if you want to just take a little bit of a break, you can do that too.
Yeah, I'll go and have my dinner.
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming. This is joint work with Ashoka University, who is at Shivnadar University. This is very new work, and this is the first time I'm presenting. So happy to get comments. So the topic of today's presentation is, are gender norms systematic to caste institutions? Examining preferences through a social experiment in North Indian villages. So as we have all heard from the morning, that the relationship between norms, personal preferences, and actual labor market outcomes are not well understood in the literature. So social norms not only influence preferences and beliefs, it also generates constraints for optimizing households. So in the context of India, restrictions on female autonomy is presumed to be a function of caste hierarchy. Several scholars have worked on this, and this is a hypothesis that they have tested. So for example, Bidner and Eswaran 2015 develop a model where they show that graded restrictions on women's autonomy is central to the stability of the caste system. So the caste system is literally standing on these graded restrictions on women's autonomy. Chakravarti et al., they use historical evidence. And again, the main point is that the purity of women has a centrality to caste purity. So there is this link between gender and caste that is coming up, but that is not well understood in terms of whether there are systematic differences in gendered preferences by caste. And so it is also empirically challenging to infer systematic variation by just simply looking at outcomes. For example, if we look at, we all know that in India, the female labor force participation, if you just disaggregate by caste, there's highest participation from the lower caste group. But does that mean that they have more gender egalitarian preferences? So we don't have a clear answer to that question. And that might be important in understanding various things of interest. For example, understanding the economic fabric in which these optimizing households are making these decisions. So what we do in this paper? So we study the presence of systematic relationship between gendered preferences, caste, and class in contemporary society. In addition, we check for the presence of pluralistic ignorance. This is a situation where individuals systematically overestimate or underestimate peer support for anything. And so we do that, we test that in the context of female labor force participation in India. So we use novel data about preferences collected through vignettes-based primary survey, and I'll be explaining what vignettes mean in a bit. Unlike previous papers, we are able to test directly this hypothesis that if lower castes have more egalitarian gender norms and lower acceptance of restrictions on female autonomy. Okay, so as I just mentioned briefly ago, that there is this some relationship that gender norms are central to caste hierarchy, and many scholars have commented on that, including historians, sociologists, anthropologists. Eswaran et al., they have a paper in 2013 which tests the idea of Sanskritization, which is that lower castes adopt restrictive upper caste norms in an attempt to go up the caste hierarchy. And they find weak evidence of Sanskritization. Deshpande 2002 has a paper where she finds that Dalits, it is not the case that Dalits have more egalitarian spousal relationships or autonomy than upper castes, by looking at NFH's data on autonomy and domestic violence. So building on this framework, we build on this body of literature. There's another body of literature on which we build on. And so this second strand of literature is about understanding the role of peer effects. So there's this emerging literature which finds that how beliefs about one's peer group and peer group support can influence actual behavior. So one recently published paper by Burstein et al., they find that married men in Saudi Arabia support women working outside when they are asked this privately. However, they underestimate support by other men around them. And there was this information updating which was done as part of an experiment in the paper, which actually improved labor market outcomes for their wives. So women were more likely to search for jobs and apply for jobs post updating of beliefs. So the point is that it is costly to make choices that are at odds with majority views. Many other papers have found this. For example, Bernhardt to a 2018 paper finds that if you look within households, men typically overestimate conservative behavior of their peers as opposed to their wives. And they also, there's a mismatch in terms of what peer expectations are within a household.
Okay, and so this might be more problematic, or it might play a more salient role in societies with barriers to female mobility, the role of peer effects, and the role of second order beliefs. So basically this is beliefs about beliefs of your peers. So as we all know, social connections, community networks are especially important in developing countries, as they substitute for the absence of markets, credit, information, etc. And these are often organized along the lines of caste and jati. Now there's another third strand of literature where we contribute and we build upon, which is this idea of a wealth paradox, which is saying that land ownership has this peculiar pervasive effect on skewing or making gender norms more restrictive. So there are these bunch of papers. For example, Balotra and Heedy paper 2003 finds that households who own land, the schooling outcomes for girls in these households are worse off as opposed to households without land. So landless households are more likely to send their girl children to school, right? So there's this tension between the source of economic well-being, and it might be that the gender norms are systematic to the source of income. So, and as we had just heard this paper on patrilocality, and since land is an immovable asset and Indian marriages are characterized by patrilocality, landowning castes are expected to have stronger son preference, and this might imply more restrictive gender attitude. So what we do in this paper is test whether, because we are collecting information on preferences and attitude towards gender, we test whether this is systematic to the indicator of well-being, economic well-being. So whether there's a difference between attitude towards gender vis-a-vis the source of income, let's say land versus other sources of asset. Okay, so precisely we ask these three questions. So first, to what extent are gender norms in general and on female work in particular are systematic to the institution of caste and economic status? Second, is pluralistic ignorance, this is the tendency to overestimate or underestimate social opposition to the female labor force participation. So henceforth, I'll refer to that as FLFP, related to the institution of caste and class. And third, how do these results change when we use land ownership as opposed to asset ownership? So to give you a glimpse of the results, so the first question, using third-party vignettes, we don't find any evidence of scheduled castes having less conservative gender attitudes. In fact, it is quite the opposite that we find in some cases. Also, we don't find that richer households have more conservative attitude, which has been a posited hypothesis. Using the social experiment, we find evidence of overestimation of conservative attitude among peers, which is higher for males. And there also we find some systematic variation by caste and class status. Third, in terms of the sensitivity of results with respect to the indicators of economic well-being, so this is one of the very interesting results that we found, which is that land ownership as an indicator of wealth has a very different dynamic as opposed to other indicators of wealth, which is coming from assets, other non-land assets for the households, for rural households. So these are the main results. Okay, so let me get into the data. So this is coming from a primary survey, which we conducted in 2019. Coming from 960 households from 2 districts, Pilibhit, which is from Western UP, and Jhajjar, which is Eastern Haryana. Now, these 2 districts are similar in terms of agroclimatic, cultural, and economic variables. So what we do in this survey is we add a bunch of questions on hypothetical third-party scenario on gender norms. And so we have 5 domains of that. I'll discuss that in a bit. So we get these responses from 960 households, both males and females. We collect information on one's own as well as second order beliefs, which is beliefs about peer beliefs, right? In a social experiment. And we collect a rich array of information on demographic details, asset ownership, land holding, size of land holding, labor participation, education levels, and so on. In addition, we also collect detailed data on time use. And if there's time, I'll show you some results on the time use bit, but that is not really the focus of this paper. Okay, so let's come to what do we do in terms of the vignettes. So we administer 16 vignette-based questions covering 5 broad themes, including social norms around women's mobility and work participation, perception on what constitutes work, attitude towards gender roles, Sanskritization practices, perception about Jati hierarchy. Let me give you an example so as to make this clear. So these are hypothetical stories about third parties, and we are eliciting response from the respondents on a scale of 1 to 5, whether you agree with this statement. And so it is basically, what this scenario is saying, that Shreya teaches in a community college school in Delhi. Her husband asked her to quit her job when her husband got promoted and his salary was increased by 40%. On a scale of 1 to 5, rate if you agree that her husband's decision is right. And so all these questions are being asked in local dialect. With the surveyors are from the local areas, so as to make it completely easy for the respondents to understand. And so generally, these respondents are very interested to answer these questions on these stories about other people, right? Okay, Farzana has a question. Yes, Farzana.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Number one is, can you tell me whether these are asked of individuals or are these couples or they just randomly selected men and women? The second question I have is whether the responses were incentivized, in terms of pecuniary incentives, so that there's no social desirability bias in the responses that they have. So that is both for beliefs as well as responses to these vignettes.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, these were asked to both men and women and not necessarily couples. And so she could be, the woman could be married, but that was not the criteria for selection into the sample. And so typically what we find is that the couple has answered the question. If the husband or the wife was not present, someone else from the household, an adult member, answered the question. And to the second question is that we did not offer any financial incentive. Yeah. So this is how it looks like. There are other examples about permission, someone forgetting to take permission, and she was severely scolded by her in-laws. Again, on a scale of 1 to 5, rate if the action is justified. So there are other examples, and there's a list of the vignettes that we used at the end of the slide. Now, one of the important things that we are able to achieve by using vignette is that through vignettes, we are keeping the latent variable fixed. The latent variable of interest is gender norms in this case. And so if there is systematic difference in the way people are rating an underlying situation, this could be attributed causally to the effect of that subgroup. Now, in order to do that, there are two assumptions that this vignette exercise is making. One is response consistency, which is that individuals use the same response category for a third party as they do while evaluating themselves. And number two is vignette equivalence, which is saying that respondents understand the vignettes in the same way. And so there are other papers which have shown that these assumptions hold. So there's work in the context of health, in the context of political economy, where vignettes-based surveys have been used, and they have found this two assumptions to be going through. Okay, so let us come to the key variables in the analysis. So the first thing is that we use this 16 vignettes response, and we apply principal component analysis to come up with a conservative score. And the second key variable is this measure of pluralistic ignorance. And you might wonder how we are measuring this. So basically, we ask each respondent to indicate how many out of 30 households from their village would allow women to work outside. And then we have also collected private beliefs on whether someone thinks if women should be allowed to work outside. And then we compare this estimate that people believe about their peers with the actual scenario, right? And thus we come up with this dummy for overestimate of conservative attitude among the peers. Okay, let's get to the empirical strategy. So here, our main goal is to understand how the outcome, here the vignette rating, this is the conservative index, or the underestimation or overestimation dummy of individual I in village V of this district T is systematically changing with respect to the wealth, and this is WQ is the wealth quintile. SC is the indicator for SC household. And so we are interested to understand how the interaction of caste and class plays a role in explaining the variation in the gendered attitude. And in this regression, we control for a lot of household level characteristics like household size, total number of children aged 0 to 5 years, 6 to 14 years, and so on, education level. We also have collected village level controls. So we have village level key informants who are giving information on the infrastructure in the village, the average daily wage rate for male and female casual laborers, whether there is labor shortage, what kind of seasonal migration is being observed. So these are key informants in the village who have answered these questions about village level characteristics, which we control for in the estimation framework. And you might think that these are somewhat capturing the demand side of the issue. Okay, so let's take a look at the descriptive stats. So as you could see, by construction, the mean of the conservative score is 0. There's higher dispersion for the females in terms of the conservative score. In terms of the proportion of people who are overestimating peer group's conservative attitude, it's 55% of males and 46% of females in the sample overestimate conservative attitude. 63% have more than above primary education. And we have household size, an average wage for males and females, and so on. Okay, yeah, Farzana, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. If you go back to your descriptive statistics, do you have any idea of what the labor force participation rate was in these villages?
Yes.
What was it?
So I think I don't exactly remember the exact stat, but we have included that in the paper. And so, what I recall is in these two regions, the female labor force participation is very low, ranging from 7 to 11%.
Okay. And the second question I had was that if you look at these, the scores by female respondents and the male respondents, if I understand correctly, is that what the first two rows are doing?
Yeah, so this is just separately including the conservative score of female members and conservative score of male members.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the worries that usually you have when we go to these villages to ask questions is this issue of privacy, right? So the moment you see some surveyor coming and then tons of people collect and so on, and of course that could be a bigger concern for sponsors to these kinds of questions. So I was wondering if instead of the score, if for each one of these questions, it would be nice to see the distribution by gender and see whether there are any systematic differences, and also if you could mention, whether privacy was maintained or whether there were these concerns and so on. So one could get a sense of, what the potential direction of the biases might be in the responses.
Sure. Yeah. So regarding privacy, it was basically that, the female surveyor called out the female respondent, and generally this was private conversation. And of course, you can't prevent people from coming in the village. But this is less of a concern, I would think, in our case, because this is, this conservative score is relating to a third party scenario. And people are evaluating a third party scenario, right? And they are not talking about themselves, right? So you would imagine this to be a less of a concern because they are not giving information about their husbands or father-in-laws for that matter, right? So this is eliciting their response on a particular situation where the latent variable is capturing some kind of gender norm. Did you have any? Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my question was about comparability of the sample to say that either the state or national averages, either in terms of FLA labor force participation or population share of SCs, etc.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, I don't think we would have external validity to take this result to the whole of India. This is, very, as you could see that, the proportion of general caste is overrepresented as you would get in a national sample. So this would hold, we did a random sampling within these two states and selected the districts, and we had like 8 villages, 30 households in each village. That was randomly designed. But what we are finding is probably we cannot extrapolate the finding to the whole of India. Okay, so let me move on. So some of the key results. Is okay, so this is the first 2 columns are responses from male members. Second 2 columns are for females. And you may want to focus on the second and the fourth column because these These include household level and village level controls. And so what we find is that for female members, if you look at the coefficient of SC, so the poorest general is the omitted category in this case. So we find that among the poorest quintile, SCs have significantly higher conservative attitude as compared to general. So there are various things going on. So I have jotted down what I want to say here. Yeah, so in the poorest quintile, SC and OBC women are significantly more conservative. So this one and this. While asset ownership has no impact on conservative attitude of general category, it does reduce conservative attitude of SC women. And so we had to test that separately. This you cannot back out from this table. But we found that with increase in wealth ownership, the conservative attitude of SC women fell down significantly. And another key result is that at highest levels of wealth, there's no significant difference in conservative attitude by caste. This is another interesting result, which is basically pointing to the interplay of caste and class in shaping these gendered outcomes, attitudes. In terms of land holding, so this is another interesting thing that we find. For the most land poor households, there's no difference between the three caste groups. And this is where this is making a distinction. This is different from the earlier result. So in the earlier result, we found that the poorest SCs were more likely to be conservative, but this does not hold for the land poorest SCs. So what we find with income from other asset does not translate if you are using land ownership. Conservative score goes down for land rich general caste. And there's a U shape for SC women. So basically, when you start at the lower levels of land holding, there's a dip in the conservative score as you go to the second quintile. However, it rises up for the very richest land quintile. So there's this U shape that we find for SC households with respect to land holding. Yeah.
I had one question. Is somebody else asking something?
Yeah. So
I forget in the specification. Do you have you don't have village fixed effects, right?
We have village fixed effects. Yes.
Okay. So in a sense, you're taking account of the demographic composition by caste. And but it would be interesting actually to see the heterogeneity by that. So one of the things that might affect these results would be what is the population size distribution across these caste groups. So I think just not in terms of population, but also economic power and caste in the distribution across caste in terms of land holdings and so on. And I was wondering whether these are comparable across these districts. So some idea of the distribution of caste, the economic status across these districts and the comparability would be nice also to see. And within that, of course, also to see what is the gender, distribution in terms of employment status and,
right.
Other variables that you might have access to.
Right. So we have included some discussion on the paper, in the paper, but yeah, so good. We will, look that in depth. Sorry, Deepshika, you had a question? Yeah.
Can you hear? Oh, yeah, this works now. What is the comparison group in this regression equation?
The comparison group, the omitted category is the first land quintile general caste.
Yeah, because I didn't see the first land quintile for SC.
So that is dropped. And that is the omitted category. That is the reference group, right?
For each of the,
each of these, yes. So it is easy to interpret what's going on with general caste groups, just looking at these numbers. But what's, the wealth effect for SCs and OBCs, you need to add the coefficients and tests separately.
Okay, I mean, I would just drop one for the general and then just keep everything so that we are comparing to one particular comparison group.
One particular comparison group is the poorest general.
Okay, okay.
That is
okay. Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was one of my questions. Do you only do vignette type or do you do other quantitative survey questions on gender attitudes?
Yeah.
well?
So we collect, a range of information on what they're actually doing in terms of time use. If I have time, I'll show you that.
Yeah, okay.
And we also I have to show you what we get in terms of the overestimate of your attitude.
Also, the third point was, did you survey only women or did you survey both men and women?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank
you. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so let me then, in the interest of time, okay, this is another thing that is interesting. So here we are plotting land ownership, land holding, land size in hectares on wealth index by each caste category. And as you can see, there's this linear, monotonic relationship for general caste as well as OBCs. However, for SCs, there's this inverted U shape, which is interesting, which is saying that at very low levels of wealth and very high levels of wealth from other assets, they are less likely to own land and the amount of land. However, that's not true in the middle group, where the land holding goes up on average. And this is only true for SC households. So this is, another interesting margins, because we are looking at the effect of land versus other wealth assets. So this is interesting to note. Okay, so in terms of what we get, for the most asset poor group, SC women and OBC women have higher conservative attitude, and this is not the prior that we started with. We were testing whether this would align with the national stats that you get to see that SC women are working more. So that should translate into higher egalitarian gender norms, but this is not what we find. We don't find differences across caste groups for men, for the most asset poor group, for the most poor group. In terms of wealth effect by caste and gender, for SC men, SC women, and also OBC men and OBC women, with increase in wealth, we find the conservative attitude is actually going down, which is again, something very opposite that what you would think, a priori. No effect for general men and general women at 5% level of significance. Wealth effect is substantial for SC and OBC women. So basically, we see that wealthiest SC and OBC women are no less or no more conservative than the wealthiest general women. So at the highest rungs of wealth index, there's no difference between caste. However, it does not translate when we use land. Similarly, wealth effect for OBC men, substantial to ensure that richest OBC men are less conservative than the richest general men. Now, this is in terms of what we find with respect to land ownership. For the most land poor households, there's no difference between the three caste groups. Negative land ownership effect for general men and general women, which is saying that if you have higher amount of land, you are less likely to be conservative. For general, this is holding true for general. This is not true for SCs. And so the land effect has this U shape for SC women, where fifth quintile SC women are more conservative than first quintile, but the second quintile are more conservative than the first. So that results in a U. With land richest SC women are more conservative than land richest general women. Land ownership and wealth ownership have very different effect on the conservative attitude of SC women. In terms of the overestimation of peer attitude, within the lowest wealth quintile, SC men are likely to overestimate conservative attitude amongst peers more strongly than general category. Within general men or women, wealth has no impact on an individual's intensity of overestimation. And within SC men, and OBC women, intensity to overestimate declines at the higher levels of wealth. This is the counterpart result with respect to land. So no caste or land ownership effect on the likelihood of overestimation for women. Farzana, I'll take your question because we are running out of time. Shall we take the question at the end? Yeah. So just hold off. Sorry. For general men and OBC men, the highest quintile is least likely to overestimate conservative attitude. And such a wealth effect is not seen for SC men. So let me conclude, and then you can ask questions. In this study, we examined this interplay of caste and class identities, how they interact in driving preferences and beliefs for these optimizing households. In the presence of pluralistic ignorance, providing information can be a very cost-effective way of changing labor market outcomes. This, which has been found in the context of Saudi Arabia, could possibly apply in this setting as well. Low-hanging fruit in terms of policy action, this is not really changing anything, but just updating the beliefs about the attitude of the, what peer group is actually thinking. And so, I have a few slides on time use if you are interested, but that's a separate paper. So I'll take your question and I'll stop now. Thank you. Yeah, Farzana, please.
Okay, yeah, I had one question about sampling. I remember when you mentioned the sampling, you said that the way you did this was essentially you went to the households and then depending on who was available, the questions were asked. And I might be understanding this completely incorrectly. So, first of all, just to try to understand how the sampling was done, because it seems that at least from that response, that it wasn't purposive sampling of SC, STs, and particularly then by women and men. So one would worry about, SC households, men not being available, so women responding, or depending upon the labor force participation, who is available and who is not. And so these could completely bias these responses, and especially the fact that you get a result which is quite contrary to what we understand typically about attitudes towards women working in low caste versus high caste. So is that something that we need to worry about in terms of the sampling? And if you could spend some more time talking about that.
Yeah, so I think we have to, look at the stats more carefully. So as you could see, the general caste is overrepresented in our sample. And since we have information on time use data, we have, to address your concerns, whether these are households who are primarily missing because they are working. Some of those concerns could be addressed when you look at time use. But, this is just, we used a random sampling of, where we did not include caste as a criteria. But
one suggestion I have, Aparajita, is I was wondering if you have any data, just the survey data. So usually, like surveyors would tell you whether they use a replacement individual within the household, or comments and so on and so forth, or it was a replacement household. So just in terms of trying to understand whether that's an issue, because the time use is not really going to give you an answer, again, because if it is a selective sample, whose time use data are you collecting? We don't know, right? So I think just getting to the heart of how the sampling was done and, this concern, I think is really important in terms of the validity of the responses you have.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll answer to that. Kanika and then Ritadi also had a question. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So again, the results that you get To what extent do you think so that there could be a higher role, like the upper caste, just because of being better educated, could have a higher social desirability bias, right? So was there any question that you asked which captured the general social desirability bias, which you can control for in your analysis, and then just rule out this possibility?
So this is again less of a concern in the, because we are using these vignettes. These are about third-party scenarios. So this is less of a concern as compared to regular survey where they answer about their own, household members. So, and we, there were various checks that we had done in order to improve the quality of the data. For example, including a question where we just change the ordering of what is the most liberal versus conservative, and looking at whether households are just randomly answering. So we do all those quality checks. In general, in the villages, this is again anecdotally speaking, people are very interested to answer these questions. Okay, these are about stories, and they are less inhibited in sharing their truthful answers. But yeah, so that's a point that we should check. If there are other ways we could use the data to check for that. Ritadi?
Yeah, so
Very brief, Ritadi.
I just, you split up by quintiles, right? So I don't know if you tried this, but maybe you can just do a crude one just by like above median, below median, because I think the effect size were pretty large. And I just think that maybe you're not getting significance sometimes because you just don't have like, the errors are getting too large. That's just my sense.
Okay. So compare the results with, more than average dummy. Okay. Nobody from IT.
Can you share the screen? Has anybody?
We don't have any other time to take questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, Aprajita. We have our final speaker joining us from Canada. Can you? He needs to share his screen. We'll welcome Nicholas Lee from Ryerson, who actually has a fascinating paper comparing the time use survey pilot of 1998 with the All India 2019. Yes, so welcome, Nick.
Oh,
Floor is
hi.
yours.
Yes. Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizers, and also especially to Ashwini for inviting me for this fabulous conference, a great opportunity to present this work in front of an expert audience. For those who are maybe curious, so Ryerson University is in Toronto, Canada. It's a few months from now, this university is going to have a different name. One of the first universities whose name has been canceled. So Mr. Ryerson was a Methodist minister in Canada in the 19th century who was actually quite instrumental in promoting public education, including universal primary education for girls, which was a controversial issue in the late 19th century Canada. However, he was also instrumental in developing a system of residential schooling that was part of a policy of forced cultural assimilation and even cultural genocide of indigenous peoples, which is why his name has been is being removed from the university, and who knows what it's going to be called in a few months. So just thought I'd put in a plug for that. Okay, so the topic I'm going to talk about is, of course, measurement. And so we've all seen, this audience has all seen some version of this graph. So I just pulled this off the ILO statistics. So what I'm just showing here is, the conventionally measured labor force participation rate for India for people and assess surveys, the employment surveys in the early period, and then the periodic labor force surveys more recently. And so, we're all kind of familiar with these trends, which is, not too much going on for men, maybe a bit of a dip in the last decade. For the story for urban women is sort of relatively flat, maybe a bit of an increase in the last decade. And of course, maybe the biggest focus of this literature is this quite precipitous decline in the labor force participation of rural women. So, how does this labor force participation get measured? So probably almost everyone in this room has looked at something like this. like in the NSS, sort of Schedule 10 employment survey. This is actually pulled directly from the 2019 time use survey, which fortunately, has a similar sort of modular question. So, you collect for every household member the sort of demographic particulars, and then this is how, the way that labor force participation is typically measured is using a question like this, right? Usual principal activity particulars, okay? And then there's a status code, and the status code, right, has categories for self-employment. It has categories for salary, like labor, casual wage labor. And then it has these categories that most of the women in India are included in, which is either attended domestic duties only, or attended domestic duties and was also engaged in free collection of goods. Things, so whether that's, vegetables, roots, firewood, cattle feed, sewing, tailoring, etc. Okay, so that's how, typically you're considered to be in the labor force if you have a code, I guess, 81 or below. So if you didn't work, but were seeking and available for work, technically, right, that's like unemployed, but maybe in the labor force. This almost no one ever reports this for usual status. Okay, so basically it's these categories make up in the labor force, and then most of the women who are not in the labor force are in these 92 and 93 categories, basically domestic duties or domestic duties plus. Okay. Now, a number of authors have pointed out, there are potential measurement issues with this usual principal activity status, right? And there's a range of sort of issues, right? So the first one, when we talk about being in the labor force or work, it's important to sort of define what we mean, right? So, this labor force participation sort of across countries is typically based on a system of national accounts, or SNA definition of work, right? So that includes all market work, and it also includes sort of self-employment or sort of home production of goods. Hence, it would include, sewing or tailoring for own household consumption, right? But it would exclude services for home consumption, in particular, right? Caregiving and like household upkeep or maintenance, which is, of course, most of the domestic duties that women are doing in India and around the world. So, so there's sort of a side issue, really. So from the perspective of trying to measure work according to an SNA definition, there's still this issue that SNA work by women is typically fragmented, right? Despite a potentially important contribution to SNA output. So everything from, seasonal agriculture work to, part-time work in household enterprises, right? To piece rate manufacturing, whether at home, things like animal husbandry, kitchen gardening, free collection of goods. Many of these things, right, are presumably things that may not be your usual status, like you only do them, a month of the year or a few days a week or a few hours a day. But of course, the way that respondents, tell you this is my usual status, right, may not map so easily into the actual amount or quantity of work that people are doing. And there are several alternative ways to measure labor force participation in India now, coming from other surveys in recent years, and they often find some differences, right? So the IHDS, I think, usually finds that female labor force participation is higher than in the NSS. And I think the CMIE, which I don't know so well, but I think typically has a lower measure. So of course, there's different definitions and how they do it and different sampling. But I think, the fact that there's some discrepancy across these different surveys highlights that there's sort of an important measurement issue underlying this measure of labor force participation. Furthermore, the panel data sets, these more recent ones, right, as work by Ashwini and other people, sort of shown that there's some really interesting labor market churn, right? So, we think about, whether women are sort of trying to find work or not. If we're trying to disentangle demand versus supply side factors, it's important to consider that, there are many women that, are in the labor force sometime and not others, which, would tend to suggest is going to be less of a demand side explanation. Like perhaps they have more, they just have trouble finding sort of longer term employment. So there's some interesting churn here that, we need to think about how that factors, how we should think about that in terms of like a usual activity status. Now, there are several studies that have used time use data in India, right, to specifically document this sort of fragmentation of work and highlight the potential underestimation of SNA work, as well as non-SNA work, right? So often one of the main purposes of time use data is to highlight that, women's contribution to economic activity construed more broadly than just the system of national accounts definition. That is, to include the sort of vital role that women play in terms of providing labor for caregiving and household upkeep. So just to motivate us a little more, a review of this literature by Fletcher, Panda, and Moore, 2018, they highlight that differences in the level of participation between the IHDS and NSS may reflect that women do not necessarily identify with work as their primary activity, and the use of more probing questions and time use data would result in more available information on the productive and even income-generating activities of women. They point out that time use surveys could identify how India's 200 million women engage primarily in domestic activities, that is, the ones that are not in the labor force. How do they spend their days? And clarify the extent to which they may already be involved in labor market activities. It would help reconcile large discrepancies in FLFP as measured by different household surveys. India's position to collect quality time use data due to the lessons of a 1998 pilot of 6 Indian states and recent announcements by the government to implement such time use surveys. So that was in 2018. So 2019 time use data is out. It's not so easy to find. So if anyone, any graduate students or anyone in the audience is interested in how to get it, I'm happy to send me an email and I'll send you instructions. It's publicly available. It's just for some reason it's not very easy to find on the government website. So the contribution here is, rather modestly, is just to provide some descriptive evidence based on combining these two waves, like the pilot from 98, 99 and the more recent data for the 6 states that are in both surveys. Right? So these are representative of these states throughout the year. So we have sort of a snapshot, 2 snapshots, representative time use for approximately 99 and 2019, right, 20 years apart. So what I'm going to look at is first, changes in the hours of SNA work for women and also men, because that turns out that's going to be an interesting part of the story, and that the relation of that to self-reported usual principal activity or labor force participation, if you want. I'll look a little bit at changes in the non-SNA time use for women, right? So what happened to domestic work during this period, and then a little bit about heterogeneity with respect to income, education, location, things like that. And please feel free to jump in with questions anytime. So just to give you a preview of my findings, perhaps not surprisingly, given what's happened to LFP, there's a quite large decline in SNA work hours for women. So in rural areas, about 87 minutes a day. Okay, so when I talk about minutes for the rest of this presentation, it's always, the metric's always going to be minutes per day. Okay, so in rural areas, women's work fell by about 87 minutes per day. That's a 36% reduction relative to 1999. Mostly due, the majority of that, 53 out of the 87 minutes, is due to a reduction in paid work. Okay, so that's a 46% reduction in paid work relative to 1999. Something that maybe was a bit that I expected a bit less, was maybe less emphasized in this literature, particularly on female labor force participation, maybe not surprisingly, but that men's SNA work also fell quite a lot, an hour in rural areas and 37 minutes in urban areas on average, due to a massive decline in paid work for men. So the fall in paid work for men, 104 minutes in rural areas and 147 minutes in urban areas, substantially larger than the decline in women's work hours, at least in absolute terms. In percentage terms, in rural areas, they're fairly similar. But there's a much larger absolute drop in paid work for men. But a difference between men and women is that for men, this decrease in paid work was partly offset by a substantial increase in self-employment. Right? Whereas for women, for rural women, there's a decline on both margins. Now, urban women, I should mention, there's basically no change in paid or sort of self-employment work. Another finding here that's, I guess, something that you can only really answer with time use data is that this decrease in SNA work for women, right, coincides with minimal change in the non-SNA work, or the sort of traditional domestic caregiving and household maintenance work for women. So there was not much increase in domestic work for women, resulting in a very large increase in leisure. Okay, so time use categories that I will classify, that will be classified as leisure. Now, obviously, there's some ambiguity about which activities exactly are literature, which activities exactly should be classified as leisure. I think during the pandemic, I spent weeks and weeks hanging out with spending time with my young children, and I'm never sure whether that should be classified as an extended vacation from academia or, some of the most challenging labor I've had to do in my life. But maybe something that's instructive here is that there's also a very large increase in sort of time spent viewing TV, which might be one of the more pure forms of leisure that you can actually observe in the survey. So leisure also increased for men, but by less. So one implication, the silver lining, if you want, on the sort of deteriorating work situation, and the fact that women, especially in rural areas, the male-female gap in minutes worked actually increased during this period, is that the male-female leisure gap fell. So men in 1999 enjoyed 51 minutes more leisure than women on average during the typical day, and that shrank to 25 minutes. Okay, so that's just sort of, okay, so forgive the advanced graphics here. So the time use, the states that were surveyed for the 1998-99 time use pilot were meant to capture sort of a regional variation in India. So but they're by no means representative of the whole country, right? But they were meant to capture, both the sort of north, south, center, west, east, and sort of northeast. And they do represent 25% of the population. So I think that's kind of interesting in its own right. But that's sort of one important caveat. So one thing just to note in terms of the trends and things I'm going to show you is that, okay, so the lines here are giving you the numbers from the NSS and the Periodic Labor Force Survey for the labor force participation. The orange dot here is for the all India sample for the 2019 survey, the response to the similar labor force participation. So you see that's almost bang on, right? So for women, it's giving you almost, the Periodic Labor Force Survey is giving you almost exactly the same thing as the responses to this time use survey for all India. But if you just then turn to the 6 time use states, those are the triangles, you'll see that for men, there's almost no difference between the time use states and the rest of the states in 2019. But for women, the labor force participation for women is higher, especially in rural areas, in the time use states relative to the all India sample. And so the trends as well, going back to 1999, the trends for the time use states are a little bit different. For men, they're very similar, but they're slightly more positive for both rural and urban women. So just something to keep in mind as a sort of a caveat to what I'm going to show you. Okay, so I showed you how the labor force survey sort of measures labor force participation. So what about the time use data? What does it look like for those who haven't sort of seen it? The actual time use is recorded something like this. So they look at, so every household member age 6 or over, from 4 a.m. on the day before the interview till 4 a.m. after, right? This is a recall survey. So you have individuals and their ages. And so basically this is being recorded in sort of slots of time. The slot length varies slightly between the 2 surveys. And then sometimes there's a question about whether people perform multiple activities in a slot, the description of the activity. There's a 3-digit code. So this is how I'm going to sort of classify things as work, leisure, not work. And importantly, and this is sort of one of the things that I think a big advantage of this kind of data, there's information on where the activity was performed, so inside the household or not. I'm not going to have much to say about it today, but especially useful is this, right? Paid or unpaid status of the activity. So for each type of activity, we can basically have a very good measure of hours of paid work, right? Are these things being paid or are they unpaid? Okay. Okay, so a little bit more on the data. So, the survey was carried out by the NSS organization. And so it uses, in both years, it uses a similar 2-stage sampling and stratification. So the survey is meant to be representative at the state level, state by sector level. And it also has, it's meant to be representative of the whole year. So the pilot survey surveyed about 18,000 households beginning in the 3rd quarter of like July of 1998 through to June of 1999. There's supposed to be space throughout the year. So this is meant to capture sort of the whole year, including seasonal patterns of labor in agriculture. The 2019 survey begins in January 2019, goes through to the end of 2019, and surveyed for the time use states, surveys 31,126 households, so slightly larger sample. Remember, all individuals age 6 and over are going to record their time use based on that 24-hour recall.
Excuse me?
And there are a few other,
Excuse me,
was there a
Professor,
question?
sorry, there's a question.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry,
So just a clarificatory question from you. I mean, I just wanted to understand whether there is any difference in the number of activities that were considered in leisure under the category of leisure in both these two time use surveys. So because you mentioned that the time gap fell for men and women. So that's what I'm interested in, whether there is any difference in the list of activities in time use survey of 1998 versus TUS 19.
Yeah, great. Okay, yeah, so good question. So I was about to sort of mention that. So there are definitely some differences between the surveys, even though the sampling is quite similar. So in particular on this question of activities, the number of activity classifications changed. So in the 98-99 survey, there were 154 activities, and in 2019, there were 165 activities. It turns out that for that, if you're trying to concord these, which I had to do for this, the concordance is actually relatively straightforward for the non-SNA activities. So there's almost a one-to-one concordance for the leisure activities and for the home production sort of domestic work. There was almost no ambiguity in terms of matching those. Where the surveys are quite different is in terms of how they measure SNA activity. So in particular, the 98-99 survey had very detailed questions on, like, say, different agricultural tasks, like time spent harvesting versus planting and transplanting, and like it had very detailed breakdown of sort of particular tasks, whereas the 2019 survey, the SNA questions were a little bit more focused towards, like, was this activity meant for like home consumption or like self-employment or for the market? Like they're more based on like the less the particular task than sort of the purpose or the market non-market distinction. So this was sort of a disappointing for me because I've done some previous work with a time use survey trying to measure like caloric requirements at the individual and household level, like how within changes in activity levels to try and answer some questions about changes in food consumption in India. But the concordance is really not very good for the SNA activities. It's much better for the non-SNA activities. So I don't think there's any issue. There are certainly a few new categories in 2019. So I think 2019 there is a question about internet, and there's some question. There's one question that's more about those kinds of things. And I think I'm not sure if the 98-99 survey had. That's probably in the other category for media use. So that there's a few activities that are much more common in 2019 than in 99 that have a distinct category. But as far as sort of being able to classify things broadly as sort of leisure or not or work, there's sort of not so much of an issue with that. The other difference is,
sorry to interrupt. I just had two quick questions. One is regarding, so when we say leisure, since there are multiple activities involved, are you saying pure leisure when there is no other activity performed, in the sense that, say, suppose I'm watching TV and say simultaneously cooking, then it's not, which is often things that women in India do, and simultaneously say taking care of a child. Would you count this as leisure, or are you going to block out only cases where it's just watching TV and there's no other work involved? That's my first question. And the second question is regarding how you're defining this SNA, because the Indian system of definition is slightly different from the United Nations system of what gets counted and where is the production boundary placed. So exactly what all activities are you including in SNA work, which I found a little difficult while using the time use data set, particularly for 2019. It would be really helpful if you could clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so so the first question, so the results I'm going to show you today are just based on the major activity classification. So in other words, if there, so one thing to keep in mind, so this is another sort of, I've sort of mentioned this here, but in 98-99, they only record a single activity per slot, and then there's a flag for whether there were multiple activities. So they record the major activity, and then there's a flag for, were there other activities, but you don't know what they are. In the 2019 survey, they potentially record multiple activities, and they tell you which one was the major activity. So I just use a major activity definition to be consistent. There is, I haven't thought about, is there, how to sort of, potentially one could flag major activities that are, where there is another activity going on, even though we don't know what they are, right? It could be, you could be doing two leisure things at the same time. So I haven't thought very hard about what to do, how exactly to deal with that issue. I think one could, in principle, you could either exclude things where there's some ambiguity, although time would not add up to 24 hours then, or sort of, classify that as dual and sort of maybe leave it outside the analysis. I don't think it will make much of a difference. So the sort of presence of multiple activities is pretty low in the survey. So it's likely to make a small quantitative difference, but I highly, highly doubt it's going to make any big difference to the what I'm going to show you today, because they're not enough multiple activity flags or slots to really make a quantitative difference. But that's a great question. I think on the second,
we have a hard stop at 5:30, so ask a very quick clarificatory question, Aprajita, and then let the speaker. No, you can ask, because the thing is the evening talk has to be bang on time because it's telecast.
Hello. Yeah, so just a follow-up question on the previous question, which is that when I look at the recent time use data, as you have pointed out, if you add up all these activities, for some cases, it's exceeding 24 hours. And so my question is, how do you deal with these cases?
Well, so if you only use the major activities, then it adds up pretty well, right? So I think the issue is that when you have multiple activities overlapping in the same time slots, then obviously you get more than 24 hours. But otherwise, I think it's fine. I mean, I think I had to do a little bit of data cleaning, but there was not a lot of households with total minutes outside of whatever it is, 1440. Yeah, so I don't believe that that's. But if you found, if you found that there's sort of, even accounting for this multiple activity thing, that there's like huge, large numbers of individuals with numbers outside of the bounds, and that's definitely something to look into. But I didn't see that issue when I did this. The other question was about definition of SNA work. So I don't know. I'm basically using the sort of the structure of the time use survey itself, which means that basically everything up to the section where the household maintenance and caregiving sort of activities begins is SNA work. So I understand that might be different than other international definitions, but it's at least consistent across the two surveys. So sort of whatever is the internal division. I'll show you a little bit the breakdown of the major one-digit categories in a minute. Okay, so just sample restrictions. I'm going to restrict to women aged and men aged 25 to 59. This doesn't matter that much, but basically I wanted to exclude all the effects of sort of increases in education, right? So when you make this restriction, time in school doesn't play much of a role. Obviously, it would play a much bigger role if you went down to 15 years and up, which is sometimes the range used, right? The time in school rose just a little bit from about 0.26 to 0.6% over this period. So changes in school are not going to play a big role here. Time in school, and then delays in marriage and fertility are also going to play less of a role. Almost all of the women in this sample are married or have been married or widowed or divorced. But the qualitative results are pretty similar for a younger age range. So let me just show you, get to some of the results here. So so here on this graph for women in the top panel and men in the bottom, right? I'm just giving you the averages for these 6 states, ages 25 to 29. And the first thing I highlighted is the changes in the labor force participation, if you want, or the usual status, similar to how labor force participation is measured for men and women. And what you'll see here is that, overall, there's not much of a change for the women in these 6 states in these data. There's a bit of a decline for rural women, and an increase for urban women, which is sort of larger than the increase that you see sort of overall for using all states from like the other surveys. But overall, not much going on. And same thing for men, right? Overall, whether you look at sort of paid work or all work, right, which is sort of a superset paid work. If you look at men, right, almost universal work status here, right, 96, 97%, 97, not much of a change, a little bit of a decline, maybe 1 percentage point. Not much of a change for paid work either, maybe a more notable 4 percentage point decline there. So there's not much of a change in usual status here or labor force participation except maybe for urban women in this sample. Okay, but when we turn to minutes, here we see there's actually a lot going on. So for women, right, there's a very large decline in minutes paid and unpaid SNA work, all being driven by rural areas. So in urban areas, there's almost no change in the number of minutes of paid work or overall work, right? So paid work is always a subset of minutes of SNA work. And then, so this is sort of, time you're getting paid doing work. This is adding all other SNA work. And then here I'm adding all the domestic work. So I'm adding the caregiving and the household maintenance categories, right? So these things always get larger. There's very little change in for urban women, but a pretty large decline for rural women, right? So a big drop in, minutes paid work and a slightly larger drop in overall SNA, right? So there's also some decline in basically self-employment or work for women. So putting it all together, right, you see that there's a pretty big decline for women. What's interesting is that, you also see that decline for men. So despite, almost no change in the usual status, right, we see this very large decline in the number of minutes of paid work for men. About 112 minutes here on average, right, which is, more than double the overall decline for women. Okay, so a much larger decline in paid work overall, where interestingly here, it's quite large for in rural areas, and it's even larger in urban areas. 147 minutes, that's like 2.5 hours less of paid work for men in urban areas. I was sort of quite surprised to see this. Now, what's interesting about the men is that, the decline in paid work is much larger than the decline in SNA work, right? So 112 minutes decline in paid work, only a 51-minute decline in SNA work. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the men are, compensating for the decline in paid work by doing a lot more self-employment. Okay, so that, especially in urban areas, is particularly notable, right? Where there's like this massive, like I said, like 2.5 hour plus decline in paid work for men, but only about a 36-minute decline in actual work. So these men are not working for pay anymore. They're just turning to self-employment. Okay, especially in urban areas, but also in rural areas, you're also seeing that. And then the third thing to highlight here is that, when we think about gaps in work and inequality in work, gender inequality, right, you see that overall, right, looking at sort of overall minutes of work or minutes of SNA here by the normal definitions, because work for women declined by about 66 minutes overall for these states, and for men, it declined by about 51 minutes, the actual gap in terms of minutes worked rose between men and women. Okay, so men were doing much more SNA work. It rose substantially. That gap rose over this period, right? Largely driven by what's happening in rural areas, because in urban areas, right, the gap actually shrank a bit because there's almost no change in SNA work for women in urban areas, and about a 36-minute decline in urban areas. Then when we think about total work, and this is all sort of important, right? Because obviously, all these women are not doing nothing all the time. They're not doing SNA work. If you actually add on all the time they spend doing domestic work, women work a lot more than men in India, right? They work an extra 51 minutes per day on average in 1998. But that big 51, so what's the converse, sort of the complement of all SNA work and domestic work is what I call leisure, right? So that includes, so here this is a broad definition of leisure that includes like sleep, as well as things that are more fun maybe. But the point being that men enjoyed 51 minutes, an extra 51 minutes a day of not working initially, and that gap shrank quite a bit. So it shrank to only about 25 minutes by the end. So it's almost basically the leisure, the gap in non-work, if you want, or leisure, fell in half during this period, and actually flipped in urban areas. So in urban areas, men were sort of enjoying more leisure in 1998, but by 2019, women, were doing less work than men overall, combining all these types of work. Okay, so next is sort of think about what's the relationship between these minutes of work and this work status. So here I'm breaking down the minutes of work based on the different definitions of work status for women. So here, something to note is that if you look at women whose usual status is some kind of work, there's a pretty big decline in minutes within those women too. Okay, so work for those women is falling, both in rural and urban areas. So conditional on reporting that you're working as your usual status, on average, you're working less minutes per day. Interestingly, the women who report that their status is not working, they do a bunch of SNA work, right? So women who are not in the, who are doing domestic duties or domestic duties plus, right, do quite a bit of work. And interestingly, this domestic plus versus domestic is quite informative. See the domestic plus, the amount of work of SNA work that the domestic plus, and remember, plus is like free collection, home production of goods for own consumption. The women who do domestic work plus are doing 241 minutes of SNA work. The women who do domestic duties only, it's 105 minutes of SNA work. So actually these domestic plus women are kind of, if you just look at it, right, are almost exactly halfway between women who report their usual status as work, usual status as domestic. The ones who are domestic plus are actually kind of almost exactly halfway. So if you wanted to make it, if you wanted to include these women in the labor force, you should count them as half, at least in 1998. Usually they're treated as not in the labor force, right, conventionally. But regardless of status, so whether you're reporting your status as working, not working, or the not working can be most of the not working categories broken up into these two groups. Regardless of the breakdown, right, there's a decline in minutes. So there's a decline in minutes within every category. And in fact, the decline, the absolute decline is larger for those that are not in the labor force. So, one implication of this is that in terms of how informative is usual work status about the actual number of minutes that women are doing in SNA work, that has actually become more informative in 2019 than it was in 1998. So 1998, women who are not working, particularly in rural areas, right, were doing quite a lot of SNA work, right? So domestic plus or not, or sort of combining these two, there's a lot of SNA work being women who are not in the labor force, but by 2019, that had fallen substantially, like almost 100 minutes. Urban areas doesn't matter as much, right? Urban areas not in the labor force typically means very little SNA work. Okay. Okay. So here's a breakdown of sort of the paid work, because I think some people are particularly interested in this variable. So in terms of minutes of paid work, right? So remember, there's a decline in minutes of paid work for men and women, except for maybe urban and women in urban areas. If you look at minutes of paid work conditional on usual status being paid, there's a pretty big decline within that category too. So within women whose usual status is paid work, there's a pretty big decline in minutes. So it's not, which is, I guess, not surprising since there's a decline in minutes and there's not much of a change in status. Another thing what you can do though, and this is a little more, maybe a bit more speculative, but you can also look at like sort of an indicator for whether there was any paid work during the day. So this any minutes of paid work is sort of a measure of like how many people in India in this age range, in these states, right, on a given day are engaged in any form of paid labor. And what's kind of interesting is that there's a very large decline in this metric. So even though the usual status paid work hasn't changed that much, on any given day, the chance that someone reports positive paid labor has fallen for both men and women by quite a lot, right? So this is like a very large decline. What's interesting then is if you say, okay, so let me condition on, is there conditional on doing paid work during a given day? So just looking at the people who are doing paid work on a given day, how many minutes of paid work do they do? That actually increased quite a lot. So conditional on working for pay on a given day, there's a substantial increase, especially for women, a bit less so for men, because men, conditional on doing paid work for men, you're already working 8 to 9 hours. So there's maybe not much of a margin, but conditional for women who do find paid work on a given day, there's an increase in the number of minutes of work. So the length of the paid work day seems to have increased, even though the number of days of paid labor has fallen along with the minutes. Okay, so here's a little breakdown by sector. I won't go through this in tons of detail. But basically, as you would expect, right, the biggest declines in work are happening in the agricultural sector, as I think, basically there's almost nothing going on in the secondary sector except for a bit of a decline for men in urban areas, maybe a small increase in rural areas. Very little happening for women in the secondary sector. In the primary sector, right, in this is what's sort of driving the big drop in rural areas. There's a huge decline in both paid work and sort of self-employment. And interestingly, the tertiary sector, right, which is supposed to be picking up the slack. I think the thing that's most interesting here is that, you know, this is what's driving the increase in self-employment for men. So it's a different story in rural and urban areas. In urban areas, right, there's a big decline in paid work and services, but an actual increase in overall work and services. Okay, so men in urban areas are getting paid less to do service work. They're less likely to find service work for pay, but they're more than compensating for that decline by doing a lot of self-employed service work. In rural areas, on the other hand, there's a small increase in the amount of paid work and services for men, which is sort of different, the opposite pattern in urban areas, but a very large overall increase in the work, self-employed work and services. So what's picking up the slack for men? So men, right, are experiencing large declines in paid agricultural labor, as well as some smaller decline in self-employed agricultural labor. So overall, big decline in work in the primary sector. What's really picking up the slack is a large increase in self-employment in the service sector. And you don't see, you know, nearly as much going on for women in this sector here. Okay. So these are the sort of one-digit categories. So when I talk about leisure, basically it's going to be these last two categories. So the time you survey both of the surveys, you can kind of break things down based on these, you know, work across different sectors I mentioned. These are the domestic duties. That's household maintenance and caregiving. I think I included community service and learning there too, but those two categories account for almost no time, so they don't really matter. From a quantitative perspective here, partly because of the restriction I made on ages. And then, you know, social, cultural, and personal care these are the leisure categories. So you got two broad categories. One is social, cultural activities and media. The other one is personal care, self-maintenance, and sleep. Obviously, sleep is like the biggest category. I think what's most notable here, so this is for women, I think what's most notable is that, you know, there's an overall increase in sort of these leisure categories, but it's not even, right? So actually there's been a shift within the non-work categories towards social, cultural activities and media and away from personal care, maintenance, and sleep, which, you know, suggests that there's sort of maybe something going on in terms of technologies or possibilities for non-work activities. Okay, so here's an even more detailed breakdown for women of some particular activities you might be interested in. Not much of a change happening in sleep, okay? But like I mentioned, a pretty large increase in TV. So TV viewing increased by about 40 minutes on average, about 45 minutes in rural areas over this period, a little bit, only 13 minutes in urban areas. So big increase in TV viewing. And I think one factor that's driving this is a very large increase in the percentage of households with a TV. So I just infer this by looking at, I assume that if there's 1 minute of TV viewing by anyone in the household in the last 24 hours, a household owns a TV. So obviously this isn't a direct measure of TV ownership.
Hi, Nick, you have to really wind up because we have a hard stop because there's an RES event and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I'll move it. Okay, so yeah, in other words, it looks like extensive margin is sort of an important factor here, maybe driving the larger increases there. Okay, so I'm almost done. So let me just remark on a couple of the dimensions of heterogeneity. So the top panel here is a sort of familiar U-shape in labor force participation for across different educational categories for women. Blue line for work, green line for paid work. So I think this is a somewhat familiar kind of graph where, interestingly, according to labor force participation here, there's over time, there's been an increase in conditional on an education category. There's an increase in labor force participation for sort of the middle categories of women or lower education categories and a bit of a decrease at the top between 98 and 2019. When you look at hours though, or minutes of work, the pattern is less clear, right? So for rural women, basically there's a decline in minutes across the entire education category. So it's a different kind of picture than for labor force. Whereas for urban women, you see, you know, it's sort of a similar pattern where there's a decrease at the top and maybe less in the middle. Okay, so the other thing I'll just remark is that if you look at leisure, you know, leisure sort of rises across the spectrum for women, across the education spectrum, but for men, the increases in leisure are much larger at the lower education categories, the most educated men. And this also applies when you look at incomes. on this chart, there's an increase in sort of leisure is concentrated for the lowest income men and women, and there's actually a decrease in leisure for the highest income men and women. The patterns hold across all the 6 states. I won't go through this, but basically there's a decline in rural work for women regardless of the state. Obviously some heterogeneity there. Let me just give you my one possible interpretation. Okay, for put a little interpretation, then I'll happy to take questions. So the way I read this, there's no notion of causality here, but I think my interpretation of these data is that, the story of how technology and gender norms have interacted here is like a little more nuanced than maybe it's sometimes portrayed. So in particular, right, we have this technology, so lower agricultural labor demand that, we're going to hear more about later from Prasanna. And one implication of this is that, men were actually hit harder in terms of hours by this decrease in agricultural labor demand, as I showed you. But, because of gender norms, men have to work. So men have increased self-employment in whatever was available. It turned out to be services here to compensate for that decline in, paid work. And one implication of that is that not only are women being squeezed by the declining availability of paid work, especially in rural areas, but also, they're being squeezed in terms of their self-employment work possibilities, right? So male and female self-employment are going in very different directions in rural areas here. Presumably, whether that's intra-household kind of crowding out or sort of market level crowding out, the potential for women to engage in non-paid labor is being squeezed out here by the compensating activity of men in response to gender norms. The other kind of technology story is that, we have this potentially leisure augmenting and labor saving domestic technology such that there's not much going on in terms of increased domestic work for women. So that decrease in SNA work is largely translating into leisure. Okay, so let me stop there and take questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but what I will encourage the audience to do is to, if you don't mind, is to send you emails with questions, and I hope you'll be able to respond to them because we have to take a short break and get back and get ready for entering the RES virtual platform. So thank you very much. This was fascinating and answered actually lots of questions that were raised earlier through the earlier presentations. So please stop the recording. We'll take a break now. We must be back here at 5 to 6.